I experienced this incident in 1997 while working as a security guard for a gated beach community in Massachusetts. It was the first weekend following Labor Day, and many business owners had already started or finished closing their doors for the year. Although there was still a regular trickle of renters, things were generally quiet at this time of year, and they would stay that way at least through September. The actual development surrounded a quarter-mile beachfront. In addition to a few avenues of connected townhouses and unattached homes, it was made up of 3 multi-story structures, with a few dozen condominium units in each. The majority of the adults would park themselves along the beach, while there were a few pools and other recreational places for the youngsters. The majority of the occupants were elderly couples and families, but there were a few groups of younger children that wandered the streets at different times of the day and night. These children ranged in age from 9 or 10 to early or middle age. You had a select group of younger tenants or residents who were more problematic than others. When quiet hours began at 11 p.m., anyone under the age of 18 was required to return to their apartments or homes. We tolerated the majority of the college students as long as they weren't too disruptive and were mostly searching for a place to drink or smoke. The majority of them had already gone back to school around this time of year, with the exception of those whose institutions were close by or who still lived close enough to visit on the weekends. There were only 3 of us working on a weekend night at around 1 in the morning. It was going to be a fairly quiet night, other from doing our routine rounds and requesting a small group of 20-somethings who were drinking by one of the pools to move to the beach. When the camera feed observing the north trail to the beach went dark, we were all gathered in the little gatehouse at the community's main entrance. I offered to look into the situation, so I borrowed one of the golf carts that we had available to us with the complex's maintenance crew. The beach was isolated from the complex's pools and residential area by a 4-acre-wide swath of trees and lush vegetation. This area of thicket was traversed by 3 trails, the north, center, and south trails, which led from the remainder of the complex to the shore. Given that it technically crossed a wildlife management area that bordered the complex, the North Trail was the longest and most isolated of the 3. The trip to the North Trail from the gatehouse took roughly 3 minutes. The complex's northeastern corner was where the trail began. Here, there was a resident parking lot, a row of storage sheds, and a small sitting area with some grills and a fire pit. I noticed that just 3 of the parking lot's 9 street lamps were on when I arrived, since it seemed darker than normal. As soon as I heard movement near a bench near the entrance to the North Trail, I was able to follow the trails of 2 teens as they fled into the wall of shadows that marked the boundary of the pathway. I shook my head and let out a small chuckle when I smelled marijuana in the breeze coming from the beach's direction. Most likely would have simply advised you to take it to the beach in any case, I murmured to myself as I made my way to the storage sheds. As I reached a panel board that was embedded in the white painted concrete wall separating the parking lot and the beginning of the underbrush, I looked back up at the street lamps and questioned whether the camera's feed going out was a symptom of a larger power-related problem. After a quick check, it was discovered that neither the streetlights nor the camera switch had been tampered with. I reset the power and after a couple of seconds flipped the switches for the streetlights and security camera back on. I was pleased to see that all 9 streetlights were once more lighted. I proudly surveyed the rest of the parking lot as I proudly collected my radio, grinning smugly at my success. How does the feed appear right now? I questioned the other 2 gatehouse security personnel. Our manager, Bill, responded in a static-filled, crackly voice. Still nothing, Tex. Get on a bus and go to the platform. Check to see whether the camera is defective in any way. On the real camera there should be a button or some other method for manually resetting it. We'll have maintenance have a look at it in the morning if it doesn't work. I answered, I'll radio you when I'm there, and let out a long, huffy sigh. I closed the panel board, reattached my radio to its belt clip, and climbed back onto the golf cart. I've traveled alone along the North Route at night before, and I must confess, it's quite unsettling. I restarted the golf cart and began traveling down the wooden path. Up until you arrived at the wooden platforms on the shore, none of the 3 pathways had any lights. I had to rely solely on the golf cart's headlights for illumination as it quickly grew dark. I anticipated there would be other people at the station when I arrived after seeing those 2 stoners run off down the route and recalling the group of children we told to go to the beach. Given that it was less frequently utilized and was located in a more remote area of the complex, the North Trail was a well-liked place for smoking and drinking. I was thinking about these things while I was rolling down the trail. I felt the radio clip on my belt shift, so I looked down to adjust it while using my other hand to steer the golf cart around a bend in the pathway. My eyes widened as I turned around and slammed on the brakes to bring the golf cart to an abrupt but violent halt. A young woman in a white camisole dress was standing in the middle of the trail. The first thing I saw was the light brown sand and mud stains on her dress. She had two huge, sunken green eyes that were ringed by slightly darker rings, and her complexion was very pale. She had jagged, ragged-looking dark brown hair that was done up in a bun with bits of sand and mud tangled in it. She was barefoot, appeared to be in a stupor, and had very frail-looking limbs. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16. I knew she had to have been under the influence of alcohol or a narcotic right quickly. I sat back down in the driver's seat and inhaled slowly and deeply while I waited for the female to move. She initially did nothing but stared straight ahead. She appeared to be looking directly at me, but I immediately realized that she was actually looking off into space and was unconcerned by my startling presence. After a few brief moments of stillness, I finally muttered, "Sorry, I didn't notice you there. Do you have your house band with you?" Residents and tenants wore residence bracelets on their wrists to show that they were lodging at the facility. I glanced swiftly over the girl's wrists and ankles before she could reply, but I couldn't see her wearing one. However, since it was out of peak season, we were quite slack on this regulation, so I chose to ignore it. The girl remained silent and had a somber expression on her face, as if something troubling had taken over her line of thought. "Are you a local?" Then I inquired, which apparently elicited a response from her since the girl's eyes suddenly came back to life and she slightly turned to face me. She shook her head vertically without saying anything. As I looked at the girl again, I trembled to think of how seriously damaged she must have been. Though a part of me wanted to go back behind the wheel, I couldn't help but feel terrible for her because I knew something distressing had occurred to her tonight. "Please drive me home." I jumped a little at the girl's surprised question. There were 2 rows of back seats in the golf cart. Although it was against the law, we frequently made exceptions for the neighborhood's elderly people and the occasional drunken person who needed help getting back home. Although I could tell there was something strange about this girl, I couldn't help but sternly nod my head as if she could take a trip with me. "You don't mind tagging along for the ride? I simply need to make a quick stop at the platform and can then take you back," I murmured to the girl as she made her way cautiously to the golf cart and stepped inside. "How is your unit doing?" "It's not that far." The girl hung her head as if she were looking down at her feet as she softly whimpered in a melancholy tone. "Is anyone now seated on the platform?" I questioned as I started driving again, moving more slowly than before in case I ran into anyone else coming back from the beach. The girl continued to droop her head and made no comment. I pursed my lips, reasoning that she must not have been in the mood to talk much, and I continued to focus on the route. The drive seemed to be taking forever because of my slow speed and the mounting anxiety coming from the weird female seated behind me. I had traveled about 3/4 of the distance and was now on the pathway's more private stretch, which briefly passed through the wildlife management area. When the girl's voice burst out and broke the enveloping calm of our voyage, I caught my first glances of the platform's lights. "Stop." I abruptly stopped the golf cart in response to the girl's urgent, strong demand. "What is the issue?" I queried the girl, who initially remained silent before gently raising her left arm to indicate in the direction of the trees. "I am present." The girl got out of the golf cart, walked off the path, and into the brush before I had a chance to react. "Where are you heading, exactly?" I inquired, partially stepping out of the golf cart as the girl began casually strolling toward the bush. I was slightly concerned and perplexed. The girl stopped, didn't turn, and kept looking forward. "It's all right. Walter will be there soon." She spoke in the same depressingly humble tone with a glimmer of hope. I was perplexed by her remark and took a time to consider my next move. The girl kept moving into the trees and bushes. I swiftly leapt out of the golf cart, caught up to her in a few lunge-like strides, and put my hand on her shoulder because I knew I couldn't let her leave by herself. "Can you please wait a moment?" My hold on her shoulder became more firm as I stumbled, and the girl eventually stopped. "In your condition, you can't be wandering around here. Tell me where your unit is, and I'll turn the cart around and carry you home." As I motioned for the girl to turn around, I was interrupted. I was rendered absolutely helpless by what I witnessed when she did. The girl's white dress was entirely torn and stained with heavy red and brown stains, and her complexion had become mottled and an unattractive light gray tone. The girl's face was completely missing, leaving a dark cavernous emptiness in its stead, as if her entire face had been taken off of her skull. This is the worst part of what I witnessed, and it has stuck with me all these years later. After initially remaining still, she progressively began to cant her head, which was accompanied by the flexing of her neck muscles and a crackling sound. I ran back to the golf cart, threw it in reverse, and yelled loudly as I tried to do a K-turn, backing into a tree. I quickly finished the move and sped back down the pathway into the complex while still keeping the faceless girl in my peripheral vision. I wasn't even fazed by the impact. I felt completely out of control of my body as my heart was racing, my stomach was grumbling, and I was breathing quickly and frantically. I had no choice but to maintain a firm foot on the golf cart's accelerator and a fixed gaze on the road in front of me until I sprung out of the route back into the parking lot. I kept up my speed as I returned to the gatehouse and even disregarded a radio call from Bill, who yelled angrily at me for my speed after spotting me on one of the cameras. Upon my return, I was frantic and unable to speak. Really though, I didn't even sprint. I was significantly perspiring and required a few minutes to collect my breath. I was being frantically questioned by Bill and the other guard about what was wrong and what had happened to the golf cart's rear. Before I finally calmed down, all I could say was that I had seen something. When I had recovered, I explained what had happened to my two co-workers and flatly refused to go back to the North Trail. Bill even suggested that I might have been the victim of a nasty joke staged by one of the more mischievous younger residents, but I could tell they were suspicious and that I was truly rattled up. He promised to let me finish my duty in the gatehouse and let me depart early after having maintenance check the camera in the morning. The following week was spent absolutely avoiding the north route, and I even felt uneasy going anywhere by myself at night around the complex. The other guards were making fun of me because they assumed I had been the victim of a well-executed hoax, but I wouldn't talk about what I saw anymore. We received a report that an unleashed dog had entered the north path, which they weren't even supposed to walk down in the first place, about 10 days later, during one of my day shifts, so I had no choice but to look into it. Fortunately, Bill decided to come with me because he was working that day as well. I was shocked when we discovered the dog right where the girl had exited the golf cart that evening. A few feet into the undergrowth, between two oak trees, the German Shepherd had been feverishly barking, whining, and scratching at the ground. I recognized the other man as a resident of the complex and recalled that he was a recently retired police officer when he arrived on the scene. He eagerly approached us when we arrived, a look of profound concern on his face. "I'm sorry about the dog," he said in a hurry. He was a member of our K9 team, and I just adopted him. The man's voice faltered as he turned to face the dog, which was still using its front paw to scratch at the ground and appeared to be focused on a single area. He used to be a cadaver dog, so I'll be honest with you, he always acted in this way when he thought he was getting a hit. Bill and I exchanged glances before returning to the man and glancing at him bewilderedly. As the speaker talked, my heart began to race. "I believe he smells a dead body. And I believe you should call the police to investigate," the speaker said. He reluctantly agreed to have us give the community's general manager a call. If this had occurred at the height of the tourist season, my opinion is that he wouldn't have, and he might have attempted to brush it off. The fact that the location in issue technically belonged to the Wildlife Management Area property meant that we had to first alert the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who maintained the site, meant that it took longer than expected for the police to arrive. In truth, the authorities did find skeletal remains when they dug the location. I was greatly concerned when I noticed that the skull the forensics team excavated was devoid of any face features while I was assisting with cordoning off the area while they worked. I later found out that the body belonged to a young woman who had been dead for around 30 years, long before the complex was even constructed. She must have passed at about the same time as a nearby 15-year-old girl went missing, whose case remained unsolved, I later read in the newspaper. I overheard one of the CSIs talking with the man whose dog discovered the burial on the day of the excavation, as the forensics team was removing the bones. I still get chills thinking about the man's response when the investigator inquired what the name of his dog was. I must publish this story. I believe that if I tell you, or even just someone, then I will be able to live with my decisions. I'm a private investigator and the owner of a small but very profitable investigation and consultancy business. My name doesn't matter. A wealthy customer contacted me to look into the disappearance of her sister, let's call her Monica, about 3 months ago. Since her parents always utilized their riches to bail her out as soon as she got into trouble as a child, Monica carried the same entitled attitude into adulthood. Most recently, Monica was sent into court-mandated treatment at a posh psychiatric and substance misuse treatment center called the Henderson Center after being pulled over for a DUI and being found in possession of more than a personal use quantity of certain very prohibited narcotics. After her required treatment period was up, Monica called her family to say she was done and that she was taking a cab back to her apartment. It was clear that she was still upset with her family for not using their great resources and power to get her out of forced rehab. She allegedly requested to be let out downtown and claimed to have errands to run, according to the driver. The last time anyone saw her was at that point. Her parents pursued this line of inquiry, offering incentives for information and engaging private detectives because the police feared she had come into conflict with some of her own dubious acquaintances. But my client had additional misgivings. She claimed that while speaking on the phone, her sister sounded unusual, her voice flat and untoned in contrast to how loud an extrovert she typically is. When questioned, the cab driver related a like tale. However, they did uncover rumors about the Henderson Center, including unethical experimental treatments, excessive secrecy, and other elements from the real-life horror stories of abusive mental hospitals in the early 20th century. None of the other investigation firms her family hired produced any concrete results. The fact is that Henderson consistently received top marks during routine inspections by state authorities. A police inquiry was not warranted, especially since Monica appeared to have left the center on her own and in good condition. Unfortunately, my own investigations were unsuccessful because a bureaucratic wall of silence prevented my small but extremely competent team of ombudsmen and trainee investigators from progressing. However, I didn't succeed in this business by accepting no as an answer. I succeeded by doing actions that others would never even contemplate. It turns out that getting yourself committed is not that difficult. After all, acting insane to get locked up isn't precisely the behavior that people would anticipate from a sane person. All it needed to get myself picked up and taken off for a 72-hour evaluation was a 911 call that used the proper buzzwords to persuade the operator that I would be a danger to both myself and others. I was one of the few psych patients from police processing that were brought to Henderson for treatment thanks to connections I'd made in the police department and municipal administration. Although it is a private hospital, they have an agreement to accept a specific number of cases from the county each month as a form of public service. I was able to start my research really once I got inside. Even though I knew it was a high-end facility that typically served the wealthy and connected when I entered, I was taken aback by how, lovely the setting felt. It appeared that the center's declared goal was to place patients under as little restraint as possible, just enough to assure their safety and the staff's, in order to foster a safe, supportive atmosphere for healing and therapy. This openness gave it a rather cozy sense and allowed me to walk around the area of the complex where my tiny private room was located with some degree of freedom. I could also use the wonderfully landscaped grounds, which were open for lower-risk patients to stroll. This park-like area was undoubtedly surrounded by a secret perimeter of electronic surveillance and security staff, but it was kept skillfully hidden from patients and other visitors to the facility. Even still, after 2 days at Henderson, I was starting to suspect that my client had sent me on a fruitless search because I had not discovered any proof of any suspicious activity at the complex. The guarded wards, where apparently high-risk patients were held, were the only site left to search. I knew that, in some locations, the part of the grounds adjacent to those wards was separated from the section I was allowed in by nothing more than a tall, dense hedge, which was difficult but not impossible for me to squeeze through unnoticed when the staff wasn't watching me too closely. Google Earth can be a pie's best friend in these situations. What I discovered on the other side wasn't alarming at first. A collection of patients arranged in 4 tidy rows, all looking in the same direction. I initially believed I had merely stumbled across some sort of planned group activity, but there was no staff member present, and no one directing the class. I moved forward while scowling. I carefully maneuvered around the group and walked up to them so they could see me in their peripheral vision before I got too close because I knew it was not a good idea to shock a patient in a mental hospital. "Hello," I called to them while scanning the area for any signs of employees. They remained silent and continued to look straight ahead. I approached one of the patients in the first row with caution. He was an elderly man with no hair on his head save for a thin white fringe. "Hello there." I spoke a little louder while sneaking a quick check around. I sprang back in horror as soon as I saw his face as he slowly turned to face me, sending a shiver down my spine. He stammered, "Hi," blinking his somewhat swollen, discolored, and unfocused eyes. When I was examining the history of abuse at mental health facilities in preparation for my inquiry at Henderson, I had previously seen faces that looked like that in images. The man had 2 black eyes, but they weren't the kind you get from fighting with your hands. This was the distinctive bruise left behind after a transorbital lobotomy, when a sharp surgical probe is inserted beneath the eyelids and into the brain via the eye socket's roof. After a few seconds, the elderly man with the bruised eyelids gently turned back to face the front without saying anything else to me. One more patient had bruises that were almost disappeared, and I observed two others with similar discoloration as I surveyed the slack, empty features of the patients standing in their orderly rows. I assumed the individuals with bruising were simply those who had the treatment most recently. They had performed the surgery on all of them, based on the entire group's submissive and captivated behavior. The practice of mass lobotomies was thought to be a thing of the past, a somber chapter in the history of medicine, but based on what I witnessed here, it was still very much alive at the Henderson Center. I took many images of the patients using the tiny digital camera I had managed to sneak into the hospital. This was the proof I required, and regardless of the inspection record's excellence, I knew it would be sufficient to at the very least trigger a state medical board investigation. I returned to the hedgerow and pushed my way through it once more, keeping my eyes tightly shut to prevent cutting my corneas as I did so. The hedgerow was tightly braided with tiny branches and leaves with sharp edges. I froze as I tried to open them from the other side. A short, older man with a grave countenance and a badly fitting brown suit turned to confront me. I knew him from my research. Dr. Henry Henderson was in front of me, surrounded by two strong hospital orderlies. He let out a deep sigh as his face darkened somewhat. "I genuinely regret that you saw that." James Thomas was his name. But he was known as the Professor by everyone. Every day I passed him in the hallways. He always left for his morning stroll around the same time I arrived to the landlord's office across from the lobby. Every time he passed, he waved and nodded. I had known him all my life. But how well do you truly know them, as they say? 10 years prior, I had taken over the building from my father, just as he had done with his own father. Despite having just graduated from college and no career prospects, my father fell ill. I then stood up. The building was a substantial, exquisite pre-war construction with more than a dozen spacious flats spread over 4 stories. The entire shakedown, including the building's history and blueprints, everything I hadn't known while growing up there, was delivered to me when the keys were turned over. Like many apartment complexes, this one too had long kept secrets. But this one had a hidden feature. A decoy wall in the top corner penthouse led to a walking crawl passage that directed you to a secret room. The professor was the apartment's tenant, and ever since I learned about it, I've worried if he's aware of it. I didn't really know him. He was aware of my family, though. Since my grandfather owned the building, he had been there. I did know that James had taught physics, algebra, and other hard sciences in the past. He had many PhDs and doctoral degrees in a range of topics. Despite being long since retired, he spent most of his time trudging in and out of his apartment while toting books that appeared to be at least as old as he was. Of course, I constantly offered to assist, but he always politely declined. He would talk to himself in the halls, as if he were continuously solving challenging puzzles in his thoughts. He did, however, occasionally come across as borderline or schizophrenic. I suppose that having a mind that thinks so quickly, consistently, and intricately makes routine encounters seem completely meaningless. Even with someone like myself, who, despite holding the title of landlord, had always found mathematics and physics intriguing and had studied them to the extent that my mental faculties would allow. Simply put, there never seemed to be any progress in trying to talk to him about any of it. Even yet, he was always friendly, and the rent dutifully showed up 2 days early. The situation had evolved over the past few months though. Only at night would I see or hear him moving in and out. Usually at the same hour. 3 a.m. He also asked if he could view our surveillance footage of the front entrances outside, making him seem more paranoid than normal. I took him into the office and showed him the dates he was requesting. He omitted all context and information regarding what or who he was looking for. He finished, thanked me, and then walked away. I rewatched the video, but all I could see was a white van that appeared and then vanished across the street. Of which anything could have become. My concern for the professor was growing. What if he had dementia already or was showing signs of it? I was unaware of his family or friends. I should possibly visit him more often. Or try to engage in more meaningful conversations that last longer. Sadly, I was never given the opportunity. The first of the month arrived, and the professor's rent was still not in. In reality, it had been a few days since I had seen him. I climbed all the way to the 4th floor. Since the professor wasn't responding to my knocks, I used the master key to gain entry. I discovered the professor dead on the kitchen floor as soon as I smelled him. When paramedics responded to my plea for help, they declared him dead and said the COD seemed to be a heart attack. At least 3 days had passed since he appeared to be dead. As I led them away, I noticed that our street now had numerous black Lincolns and a dozen white vans with men in black suits getting out of them. They appeared official. 3 of the men came over and questioned if I was the landlord Frank Kelly. They identified themselves as members of the Harlow family and informed me that they needed immediate entry to his flat. I claimed to have known him my entire life and that I had no idea he had a family. They declared that it didn't matter to them and that they would still go in. Without or with my permission. 2 sizable, unmarked moving trucks then rolled onto the roadway. As the paramedics loaded Harlow's body into the ambulance, 1 of the vans and 3 of the Lincolns trailed closely behind. The remainder of the evening was spent observing the men in black suits removing everything from the professor's residence. They made swift, stealthy movements. In fact, it was so silent that I didn't hear a single tenant complaint. The moving trucks and Lincolns had left in the morning, along with practically all of the vans. Almost. 1 was still standing in front, across the street. Before lunch, I called the hospital to ask about the delivery of the professor's body and the preparations being made. But there was no record of a visitor with the administrators. Last night, there was only 1 call to our region, and the responding paramedics identified it as a joke. I noted the van's license plate since I was curious about what was happening. I asked our police officer tenant if he could look into it as he was one of our tenants. He contacted me again an hour later. I was correct, the van had official license plates. High caliber. The tenant policeman told me to keep my head down but was unable to even identify which branch. This is something I've never been good at. Was the professor onto anything the government wanted to know about last night, given how quickly and secretively everything happened? Is there a plot? Theories? Possibly an algorithm? Since they confiscated all Dad owned, I knew I would never learn the truth. Everything in his apartment, even the light bulbs, was gone. The walls, ceiling, and floors all gave off a bleachy odor. I then recalled the secret room. Had the professor been informed about it? I suppose this was my chance to learn more. I awaited that evening. I kept my flashlight low when I entered the apartment because the government van was still in the driveway. I went to the penthouse's back bedroom, where the trick wall was located. In accordance with what my father had previously explained, I shifted it backwards and upwards. I pushed the panel open and entered after it had moved. I shut it behind me and flipped a temporary switch to turn on the light. The subterranean route became illuminated, and from where I was standing, I could see the secret room. I feared what I may discover. But the moment I stepped inside, my anxiety subsided. The space was entirely occupied by untouched study materials of every description. I suppose the government officials hadn't discovered it. I entered the office and was immediately struck by the sheer volume of books and information that lined the walls and shelves. Anything from linguistics to mathematics to quantum computing and much more, including philosophy and theology. The desk was littered with schematics and notes. A substantial diary with a leather cover was sitting on top of them all. I don't know what struck me, but I grabbed it up without even realizing it. I then heard the apartment's front door close. I froze. Steps were heard in the living room. The brightness, shudder. What if they discover it in the wall panel's crack? I made a stealthy retreat through the walkway to the light switch. As I snapped it off, I stiffened up throughout, scanning the darkness for any additional motion. 2 sets of footsteps and hushed conversation were audible to me. As they entered the bedroom, I experienced a pit in my stomach. Why should I be anxious? I mean, this was my space. So why was I there? The entire building was mine. I should march over there and inquire as to who the devil was occupying my position. I didn't, though. I waited for the 2 sets of feet to exit the apartment while crouching in the pitch-black subterranean passage. I continued to wait for another 10 minutes, just to make sure, as the door shut behind them. I then slipped back through the professor's house and out the trick wall. The hallway outside the room was quiet and deserted, which calmed my fears that there may be someone or something there. As was the descent to my apartment stairs. When I came in, I left the lights off. After triple locking my door, I walked into my study to review the journal I had obtained from the professor. Although I wasn't happy I had gotten it, I was intrigued. What harm could it do at this point? The diary was almost the same size as a phone book. Massive pages of abstract and linear algebra were there, dipping and weaving through topology, cryptography, manifold theories, and tensor calculus. Diagrams and equations from quantum field and continuum mechanics, electromagnetism, and gravitational potentials were incomprehensible. I rapidly became disoriented, but I discovered that there were passages in the journal that helped me remember the understandable, mostly rational man I'd exchanged so many good mornings with in the corridor. It seemed as though the professor would spend hours breaking down these complicated issues across dozens of pages, just to spend an afternoon talking sanely about them for a few pages. The more I read, the less certain I became that these were the ramblings of a madman or the thoughts of someone who knew things that would make a sane man insane. Then there were the illustrations. Stunningly detailed illustrations of horrors that could only exist in a psychopath's imagination. Massive, wriggling monstrosities that blatantly violate biology and physics are reaching and snapping forward to feed. Abominations that, if seen emerging from the waters, would instantly kill millions of people with heart attacks. Our position in the universe has been greatly exaggerated if these things, these impossibly created things, might come to pass and become a part of our reality. I felt as though they tightened their grip on me just by glancing at the paintings, and waves of heat flashed across my body. I had to put down my journal. I was starting to feel it. I lit a cigarette and went to the window. The van remained in place. The longer I possessed the book, the more scary it seemed. But I couldn't help but want to know more. Where did everything go? Now that it was well past midnight, I tried to fall asleep but gave up because it was useless. I stood up, made a whiskey, and opened the journal once more. A lengthy collection of further drawings, violent depictions of the waters rising, opened it. When biblical storms hit cities and villages, there was widespread havoc. Oceanic portals popped up, allowing those unsettling animals to enter our globe in large numbers. Those science-based monsters. Huge tusks protruding from the jaws of the horrors. Not tusks, please. Tentacles, writhing about like the kraken but affixed to mountainous monsters with dragon bodies and teeth. Grasping, reaching, and gnashing. There were justifications for the entities, even brief philosophies. Despite the fact that they were not inherently bad beings, they could quickly overpower us and destroy us. They were simply too far ahead for us to comprehend in terms of morality and ethics. Quite similar to how we could see a mosquito. Or how others could perceive us. Near the conclusion, I quickly skimmed. A sizable piece of tracing paper was tucked into the final pages after being folded down multiple times. I opened it up to reveal what looked like tree roots. Or perhaps it was a tree branch. Or our cardiovascular system? Lines split off from the paper's bottom and extended outward, covering the entire surface. Each line had an X at the end and was drawn out so that it appeared to come to an end. However, one line had a big O at the end of it. Above it, the words Tuscan's Gate were drawn. The triangle was located immediately after the circle and was unconnected to any of the branching lines. It bore the name the Sarkadian Ridge on its label. With the intention of returning to it later, I once again folded the sheet. The most recent entry has 2 words put down at the start and was made 4 days ago. The first word contained 22 letters, whereas the second word contained 31. There was an entire page devoted to the locution of each word, explaining every nuance. The first half of the page provided a point-by-point analysis of how each portion of each letter was to be pronounced and how they blended together. Even when I took my time and carefully said each syllable, It was still very challenging to say the words on their own. But it appeared impossible to adequately articulate them in two distinct but flowing shapes. But I kept reading. The professor had noted at the bottom of one of the pages that the two terms roughly translated to our world and their world. I once more pulled out the tracing paper. I spread the sheet out on the floor and circled it, taking several angles of observation. Then it dawned on me. I removed a city map from my cabinet and covered it with the tracing paper. Everything on the map, streets, subways, and electrical lines, lined up with a branching thread of a different size on the tracing paper. It was just along the seawall as I looked for the one line that ended at Tuscan's Gate. In front of the gate, the Sarcadian Ridge appeared to be 1 mile offshore. I would be able to see where the gate, or whatever it was if it weren't for the new structure being constructed across the street. The explanation on the last page was very unnerving. They were preparing an assault on our planet with those beings, these bastards of science. The size of us. They would launch an EMP from the Sarcadian Ridge using the Earth's own electromagnetic field, which would have an immediate global impact and disable all electrical and battery-powered devices as well as communications. The storms would then begin. Sea levels would rise and then fall. It would become foggy. And the animals followed it? The ridge was a semi-open fissure between dimensions that could be exploited to enter ours. It was situated on tectonic fault lines that it shared with the gate and looked out over a huge array of geothermal vents. The creatures seemed to be gradually learning how to move through. The human race would vanish in a matter of days if and when they did. Only to fade into cosmic obscurity as a footnote, at most. It was conceivable to see the huge gathering of grotesqueries approaching the ridge on their own plane from the gate and in certain situations by physically arriving there. The professor had also discovered how. Only at a specific period on our plane of reality could it be accessed. 3:47 a.m. The gap between our world and theirs was most permeable at that time. They and we overlapped in space and time in an unseen way. However, time collapsed on itself there. There was no time, as in. There, eons may pass while we are halted in time here. It had been seen and visited by the professor. He returned a changed, troubled man who had lost faith in humanity. The journal's final sentence was scribbled in terror. I tried to halt it, but this is going to be our last breath. Then it was over. The rear cover appeared after a few blank pages. I read the last phrase several times, praying to God that I wasn't reading the musings of a lunatic. A brilliant crazy with twisted wires and a terrifying imagination. But that simply wasn't how it felt. I returned to those two words in the journal. The ones that stood for their world and our world. They featured numerous vowels in a succession and sounded like butchered tongue twisters when I tried to speak them again. I glanced at the clock. 3:30 a.m. Everything was so unsure that I couldn't help but feel nervous. These writings may be the height of madness. Yet the professor did pass away. Additionally, officials did arrive and clear out his residence. They were able to remove his ambulance pickup from the records and somehow erase it. One of their vans was still parked in front. I decided that the only way to know for sure was to follow the professor's lead, so I wrote down the lengthy phrases and put them in my pocket. When he made his notes, he had already gone to Tuscan's Gate and spoken the phrase that summoned the dimension of the cursed monstrosities. I would follow suit and have a look for myself if they were real and their world was real. I would at least be aware then. I locked the journal in my safe, but I'm sure that wouldn't safeguard it if the government authorities below knew I had it. I slipped out via a gap in the back fence after sneaking down the service stairs. I descended to the seawall using the side streets and the alley. As close as I could go to the location on the map, I arrived at the seawall. The stars were visible and the sky was clear. It was a lovely night. I had 17 minutes to think out how to say the words as it was also 3:30. I took the paper out and began reading the translation for their world. Despite being the shorter of the two, it was nevertheless the second longest word I had ever seen. I began saying it slowly, and as I did, it took on a beat similar to a stream of lines without breaks. I said it over and over. As the flow improved, I began to feel it out more and became aware of the word's alternating stress patterns. It was 3:46. I inhaled deeply and turned to face the sea. The Circadian ridge was buried a mile below the surface somewhere, ready to be exposed. Maybe all I was a lonely, bored landlord looking for some excitement. Even those that are false. 3:47. I started saying the word once more. I experienced an unusual tingle in my vocal cords when the flow picked back up. Around me, the streetlights started to flicker and darken. The seawall was struck by the rising tide that rose below. Then a retreat. After saying it once again, a blast of chilly air smacked my body. The sky was different. Water quality had changed. Everything was different. Behind me, the buildings had vanished. Roads, vehicles, and even the seawall. I was experiencing a complete sensory overload as I stood on a rocky embankment. It was all so overwhelming. The foul odor made me think of gutted sea creatures decomposing in dumpsters in the dead of July. Huge, bellowing miscreants were roaring, shattering my head, blowing out my eardrums, and shaking the ground beneath me. I experienced small ice crystals biting into my lungs with each breath I inhaled. The mist of the corrosive sea water irritated my eyes. However, none of those could match what I was looking at. Wherever the ridge might be, a never-ending cloud formation was forming above the ocean. Blinding lightning strikes were being fired deep into the ocean by a powerful electrical storm that was raging through the sky. Below the howling storm, a vortex was whirling. It's all there to welcome the massive influx of people from this dimension. The animals. Millions of them existed. From tiny rodents to things the size of skyscrapers, there were more than I could see. More dreadful and unfathomable than the paintings dared to depict. Even from the great distance I was at, they emanated a dreadful energy about them that seemed like some sort of radiation hitting my flesh. I'd seen enough. When I went back to the paper with the text, I discovered that it had become wet. Shit. I protected it by holding it close and shielding it from the pouring, slightly acidic rain that was starting to erode it. I began aloud reading the first word. The extended one. The phrase that means our world. For that first word, I had gotten into the rhythm of the language, in whatever language it was written, and I was hoping the technical proficiency would carry over to this one. However, nothing was altering. I remained in place. And to make matters worse, I was recognized by the animals. Some of them began to retreat from the ridge and drew frighteningly close to me. I repeated the term over and over. And once more and again. However, nothing. The creatures were approaching. One of the smaller ones, about the size of a horse but with many more legs and 6 sets of jaws, was running in my direction with its lips open and piercing shrieks erupting from its Jovian voice cords. The word continued coming out of my mouth, singing it, and being said in various ways, but to no avail. When I looked back, I could barely see one of the creatures because it had just emerged from the water. It had a mass of tentacles that were massing and flailing about as it searched for something to suck into its enormous maw. I was able to see down into its stomach and down into its throat when its jaws opened. Looking into a Mandelbrot fractal was how it felt. Constantly evolving, while growing both within and externally. As they grew up from the stomach, faces, mouths, and teeth would appear and then vanish. I was aware that just seeing it had set off a mental switch, and any remaining sanity had left me. Never again would I be the same. If I make it through this. I was able to stammer out the word again in a short, flowing vocalization as the creature's maw was ready to close over my head. My senses were no longer being attacked. Once more, I was lying on the seawall bike path's harsh cement. I had returned to our planet. Although it was almost completely eaten away, the paper was still in my palm. I had no concern. I allowed it to fall into the sea and over the cliff. Walking back to my building was difficult. My chest and lungs hurt, and I didn't feel well. My body felt as though it had just completed a series of marathons. I entered the building by the back entrance, but I quickly realized I would not make it to my flat. I asked the police officer who had earlier helped me to take me immediately to the hospital when I stopped at his apartment. I experienced a sharp chest discomfort on the way there. It cut through the left arm of mine. Oh no! My heart was about to attack. After a week of operations and 3 weeks of rest, I was allowed to leave the hospital thanks to our timely arrival. I still had the journal in my safe. I deposited it upstairs in the professor's secret room after deciding that it was too dangerous to have. I sat down and had a serious talk with myself about burning it one sheet at a time in my sink. But came to the conclusion that perhaps someone would find the knowledge in it useful at some point in the future. I'll be keeping an eye on the seawall till that time comes. And keeping an eye out for a rising tide and then diminish. My mother and I moved to a small Massachusetts town when I was 7 years old. My father had just upped and left a few weeks prior, so it was a difficult time for me. He had accepted a better position elsewhere, according to my mother. She assured me that Dad still cared for and cherished me, but even at that little age, I knew that he had abandoned us. I started at my new school on October 25th, during Halloween week. I insisted on walking there by myself because I was an obstinate 7-year-old. My mother scowled, gave it some thinking, and eventually agreed, but with a catch. Okay, as long as we go the trail together each evening before classes begin and you agree to stay on it. It wouldn't be far because she acquired a tiny 2-bedroom home less than a mile from my school. It was a cute small cottage, but I suppose nothing could really feel like home with my father gone. We went on a walk into the woodland behind our house the evening before I started school. Despite the sun beginning to set, the walkway was well lit. What a lovely way to get to school. This house was still available, can you believe it? She spoke. Despite not speaking, I nodded. You know, we used to have family here. I absolutely enjoy being here, my mother responded with a smile. I entered the kitchen the following morning and was welcomed with pancakes and a friendly smile. My mother must have seen that I was tense as I sat down to eat because she sat down next to me. You'll make friends here, so don't worry. I feel fantastic, she declared. Looking back, I find it difficult to comprehend how she was able to remain so strong after her husband left her. I really wish I had some of her fortitude. I proceeded down the trail as we had rehearsed doing it every evening. A tall teacher with large glasses welcomed me at the door and guided me into the classroom when I first got to the school. I sat down with the other 10 students, and the teacher started talking about the year ahead and what we would learn. Nobody was intentionally cruel to me, but nobody really spoke to me either. The other children hardly even noticed a new child was present because they were all preoccupied with discussing their Halloween costumes. However, there was one young girl who made a greeting. She sat 2 rows behind the other kids, so I assumed that she might be a new student at the school as well. She had brown hair, glasses, and was quite attractive. When I turned to look at her, she caught my eye and grinned broadly. She was so attractive that it was difficult for me to smile back, even if I tried. I tried to listen to the teacher when I turned around, but all I could think about was her. At 3:30, school was out for the day. I quickly grabbed my suitcase and ran outside in the direction of my house, eager to get home and tell my mother about the lovely girl who had smiled at me. I was making my way home quickly when I suddenly tripped over something and crashed to the ground, hurting my knee. I got to my feet to assess my wound and turned to see what had caused me to trip. The largest crow I have ever seen appeared. What was strange about its eyes, too? I heard someone behind me as I moved up close to study it. She said, "Hello, I remember you from school." I was surprised to see the attractive classmate when I swiftly looked up. I was mortified and quickly climbed to my feet, wondering if she had seen me fall. Even though my knee was hurting quite a bit, I was more concerned with how I seemed to her. Yeah, I believe I saw you in class today. Danny is my name, I declared. I'm Rosie, she retorted, grinning in return. Together, we took the trail south. How is your leg? She inquired. I tried to sound tough by saying, "Oh, it's okay." You reside here as well, huh? She informed me that she had a trail leading through the forest behind her house that led to the school and that her family had resided in this town for a while. We became fast friends. She shocked me by asking if she could see how my house looked as we approached it. You made such a good job on it. I grinned immediately and rapped on my front door. My mother spoke up, looking shocked to see Rosie standing next to me. "Well, you don't waste time making friends, do you, Jim?" she added with a smile. "Will you formally introduce the young woman or will you remain silent?" "This is Rosie," I murmured, my face turning scarlet. "She lives nearby and we met today at school." I tried to maintain my composure while acting excited. I answered, "She wants to come over." "Greetings, ma'am, I was curious to view your home." "My family also resides in this area," Rosie chuckled. "Enter quickly, sweetheart." My mother responded, "I just finished baking a batch of cookies." The three of us were chatting at the kitchen table when we brought up Halloween. My mother questioned, "What are you dressing as, Rosie?" "This year, I'm going to dress as a witch." "I've heard they're terrifying," remarked Rosie. "Witches are not dangerous." I spoke hurriedly. "Well, I was going to attend as a witch, but my family is out of town this weekend and I don't really have a place to stay yet," Rosie amended herself, smiling once again. "They said that I was too young to travel with them on their business vacation. They requested my regular nanny, but she became ill yesterday, so now." My mother cut her off. "You are more than welcome to stay with us over the weekend and go trick-or-treating with us if your parents are okay with it." I recognized right then and there that my mother was, in fact, the best mother in the entire world. "Jim, what do you think?" Mom asked while trying to hide her smile. "Yes, that is a fantastic concept," I said. My mother drove Rosie home to meet her parents and request their approval for her to spend the weekend at our house. I inquired about it with my mother when she arrived home. My mother exclaimed, "It went great. I believe that her mother and aunt look after her. Down the trail, they reside in a charming small cottage. They welcomed me inside, and we had a lengthy conversation. They both felt it was a brilliant idea. Though I do have a query. You must have a crush on this chick." Pretending I hurriedly crossed the room to my room and shut the door because I didn't hear her. "Do your homework," I said. "I love you," feeling a bit ashamed. I attempted to sleep that night, but I was too thrilled for Halloween. I had only been off a short while when I already had a friend. It was going to be a fantastic weekend. I started to notice something in the corner of my room as I considered how this might actually be a fresh start. I initially believed I was dreaming, but eventually my eyes started to focus. A tall man with long, dark hair and a gray beard was there. He had intense, piercing eyes. They fixed their unwavering gaze on the window. My entire body began to shake with fright. I ducked beneath the covers, like it wasn't happening, and hoped he hadn't noticed. I nearly yelled in fright when I peeked out from under. He was simply floating there while wielding an enormous axe that appeared to be covered in blood. I felt frozen and wanted to scream and flee the room. I was unable to speak. I'm not sure how I went to sleep, but when I woke up the following morning, he was gone, and it was as if nothing had ever occurred. I wanted to tell my mother, but for some reason I simply couldn't. I have no idea why. The week passed fast, but every evening the man in my room would come back, always carrying the big axe. He would occasionally just stare out the window while pacing back and forth on other evenings. His mouth moved, but he didn't say anything. The night before Halloween, after much terror and astonishment, he finally turned his head and looked at me. He looked directly into my eyes and moved forward. I began to tremble with panic as I pulled the blankets over my head. Was this actually happening? Was I nuts, or what? On Halloween, I almost told Rosie about the man who was staying at my place. I felt bad for not telling her because this weekend was the only thing I had been joyful about in a while, and I was afraid she would think I was crazy or something. That evening, Rosie and I visited various residences. I made an effort to enjoy myself, but I couldn't help but wonder what would transpire when she spent the night at my house. Was the man going to return? Will he spot her? I pretended there was nothing wrong when she inquired what was wrong. When we returned home, my mother had set up a sleeping area for us in the living room. I had a blanket put out on the floor and Rosie was going to sleep on the couch. We exchanged chocolates while expressing our shared fatigue. We were instructed to wake up my mother, who was dozing in the adjacent room, if we needed anything at all. Rosie and I went to bed that night as the wind began to roar against the windows. I convinced myself that since I had never seen the man outside of my room, we would be safe in this location. Although I felt bad, having a friend with me at night was simply so pleasant. I was unable to confront him again by myself. The storm grew louder and louder as midnight approached. I was growing increasingly sleepy while gazing up at the ceiling when I heard Rosie inquire, "Danny, are you awake?" I said, "I'm up. I'm unable to sleep since it's cold. Does anyone else have a blanket?" She inquired. When I realized what I had just said, I froze after telling her I had one in my room. I'd have to return to my room. I knocked on my mother's door for a blanket in an effort to find some other solution, but she didn't answer. Even knocking failed to wake her up because the storm was so loud. I considered screaming her name, but then I remembered how silly I would appear to Rosie if I did. She inquired once more, "Didn't you say you had a blanket in your room?" I answered after taking a long breath, "Yes, I'll grab it for you." I cautiously opened the door and found no evidence of a monster or ghost. I swiftly rushed over to the distant closet to locate the spare blanket while holding my breath. I halted as I heard the door close behind me as I rummaged through my clothing. Now that the wind was almost shaking the house, it took all of my confidence to turn around. However, there was no ghost. There was only Rosie. I remarked, "Oh, it's just you." "Who were you expecting, the boogeyman?" Rosie asked with a smile. It was at that point that I realized she seemed strange. I saw she was significantly taller than she had been previously as she closed the door behind her. My room was fairly dark with the door closed, but were her eyes red? I thought I saw two tiny red spots where her eyes should have been, peering back. She chuckled and continued, "You shouldn't have let me in, Danny," in a gentle voice. "Rosie?" "It's not funny," I said. She remarked, "I find it extremely humorous." I noticed she had a huge knife in her hand as she moved across the room. What had once been a stunning young woman with a dazzling grin was now an aged, haggard-looking woman as the moon beamed across her face. She inquired, "Want to cuddle, Danny?" I ran into the room's corner and yelled for my mother. "Danny, she can't hear you." "You won't get through to her," stated Rosie. I was stuck with nowhere to go but watch her inch closer. I was unable to move because I was so terrified. I was left with no choice but to watch as she held the blade above her head and grinned menacingly. I will always remember what happened after that. Before she could lower the knife, she noticed something. She leaned back in terror as she turned to face the window. He halted her as she yelled and fell on the ground while desperately attempting to flee. The tall man struck her neck with the axe while still holding her in his one hand. She screamed in pain and terror, her neck now partially severed as she continued to attempt to crawl away. He trapped her to the ground by stomping firmly on her back. Then, using both hands to bring the axe down forcefully, he nearly completely severed her neck. A powerful tug was followed by a gruesome ripping sound. As the man totally lifted her head off her body, I heard a terrible pop. I was left with no choice but to observe as he opened the window and dragged her body and head into the woods. Stunned, I peered about. I just stood there and watched till he fully vanished despite the fact that I could hardly see. My mother wasn't responding when I called her name to try to wake her up. I went back to my room and remained by the window after making sure she was secure. I believe I was shocked in some way. I eventually heard her door open. I ran over to her and gave her a tight hug. "Happy morning. Did you two enjoy yourselves last night?" she inquired, as if she had not heard anything. Unable to express myself, I simply nodded slowly. "Tell Rosie to come back in 2 shakes for breakfast." My mother questioned, "Is she still asleep on the couch?" "Ooh," I said in response, adding that her mother had already picked her up. My mom then started making breakfast in the kitchen. If her parents really did come to get her, I wondered what I would say. If her parents were human, which is quite doubtful, they would probably be relieved that she was gone. The beginning of a new chapter in my life began that year. I was now aware that demons, witches, ghosts, terrible entities, etc., were not the stuff of fairy tales but actually existed. Now that I'm older, I also have my own family. I haven't mentioned any of this to my wife since my son was born a few months ago. I've never managed to time it quite right to inform her. One final point. When I was a child, my mother had sat down next to me and pulled out a photo album a few days after Halloween. I observed her casually flipping through the pictures before I intervened. I questioned, "Who is that man?" "Him? Your great-grandfather is that," she said. I focused on the image. He was there. The next night, I slept better. He continued to occasionally be seen gazing out my window into the night. I knew Rosie wouldn't be the last horrible thing I encountered, and I was also concerned about my kid, who was just a baby. I'm standing over my son's crib on Halloween night, gazing out into the shadowy woodland beyond. They know nothing, but I can feel something approaching for us. We're not on our own. My buddies have always been oddballs. They all chose manly occupations like construction, forestry, and working on oil rigs. In our little group of high school friends, I'm the bad guy. I entered IT. They always insult me for working on nerdy things, and I always return the favor. Me not a fan of computers. I make holes. Even though I seem like a strange addition to their circle of friends, it somehow works. We are currently in a bar. On one of the few times when everyone is back in town, we are getting wasted and telling horror stories about the workplace. Someone recalls how 3 individuals were killed a few years ago when a portion of their oil rig blew up. Tommy, a real lumberjack, recalls witnessing a man working nearby get his arm completely severed by a log line. One fast zip and a limb was in the air. As the man bled out, stuttering and whining in anguish, he pressed a shirt to the cut until a life flight arrived, 2 hours too late. I'm sitting there the entire time, aware that I have a story to tell. But it's not the kind of story I often tell to a group of inebriated sort of friends, or to anyone for that matter. It's the kind of memory that is so genuinely frightening that you worry that if you mention it, you could give it life. Make it more realistic by feeding it in some way. I keep it trapped and dangerously at the back of my mind and don't think about letting it out. Before now, I'm just sitting there as everyone speaks already. Looking protected, seeming plain. I thus disregard the voice in my head that says, "Don't." My throat is getting dry and tighter, but I ignore it. Don't. I have one. They appear astonished when my voice trembles. I'm taken aback. They all gaze at me incredulously and amusedly. The looks suggest, "Go on then." And that's what I do. On our 30 acres outside a tiny Alaskan town, I conduct business from home. No children live with me. A college town, that is. A little liberal arts institution with only a few hundred students, yet the center of the community. The campus is enormous, and the surrounding scenery is a major lure. The university is bordered by reservation territory, and the tribe essentially serves as park rangers for the hundreds of miles of forested pathways. On the other side of the campus, my property borders a portion of it. One day, I'm outside on my property's cleared edge, directly behind my home. About 200 yards separate it from the home. While watering a row of raised beds I have close to the tree line and simply taking in the hot, beautiful day, something strange occurs. A few hundred feet into the woods, there comes a sound like a recorded voice speaking. It's similar to when someone speaks to you on a faulty cell phone connection, just fragments of the words get transmitted, and the rest is simply noise, but you can know the words are intended to be said. It says, "A, theg, ta, ga, gay." I simply stood there, interested but unafraid, listening to the noise. Not even the hose was turned off by me. Looking back, I believe this is the reason it took me so long to start freaking out and taking it seriously. Such strange, mysterious events take place late at night in the middle of the woods. Not when you're standing in your backyard at 1 in the afternoon. It abruptly comes to an end after about 30 seconds. Then, in order to determine whether it really ceased or just became quieter, I turn the water off. Nothing. It's a small quirk that I store away. Something that will either be forgotten or mentioned in passing at a later time. My first regret was that. Move forward a few weeks. I'm out for a trek near the back of my property on a track I started last summer, which is now largely overgrown. I'm simply taking in the wonderful midsummer weather as I stroll, mind wandering among the trees. When I hear that strange sound in the woods, I am startled out of my thoughts. There is the sound of mangled human voice in the distance. But the woodland around me seems strangely calm. I don't like to take many risks, and I normally prefer looking crazy to dying. I turn and slowly make my way back to the trailhead since I don't want to startle any large predators by running away abruptly. What in the world is that noise, anyway? When Tommy comes to visit in 2 weeks, I make a decision to take him with me to check it out. I'm back at the trailhead 2 weeks later. I'm by myself because Tommy abandoned me. I assured him that after I passed away, I would visit his apartment and terrorize the living daylights out of him. I'm gazing along the forest trail that seems innocent enough. I prepare myself. I make sure I have bear spray, a new Bowie knife that I don't know how to use, and my rucksack. Just a sound, she said. I move on the journey. After traveling for about an hour and a few miles, I start to notice that strange sound in the distance. It's just off the side of the trail and 100 yards or so ahead. However, the forest sways and rustles in that comfortable, soothing way as though it were alive. I continue. I put my hand to the hilt of my Bowie knife as I move closer to the source of the sound. The sound is now about 20 feet away, but its origin is not immediately clear. There is a distinct crackling sound to it, but it is still the same stream of incomprehensible babble. I notice a tiny black speaker that is fastened to a tree about 10 feet above the ground when I look up. Ha! I remove my hand from my knife and look it over, feeling rather satisfied that the speaker is not a threat. The words Forestry Department and the name of the nearby college are written in white paint on the speaker's side. Ah, a hint. And a plausible justification. Oh, right. You prickly jumper. I return home satisfied that I won't need to stab anyone or haunt any apartments today. The next week, on a slow day, I give the college's forestry department a call. Yes, the dean, please hear from me. I'm not a student, I say. They are unaware that I am phoning, so no. The dean spoke in a bored tone when he responded, but he appeared ready to address my concerns as if I were the highlight of his otherwise unremarkable day. It turns out that the speaker is, or was, a kind of live art project where students could compose and record poetry that would be read aloud in the woods. Although it is solar powered, he thought the speaker's connection had broken. Someone was meant to come out once per semester and add fresh MP3s to a waterproof MP3 player that was placed close to the bases of each tree. He continued by saying that the surrounding tribes' protest forced them to abandon the project. He initially refused their pleas to remove the speakers, but when complaints persisted and the college's vice president became concerned about deteriorating relations with the tribe, he eventually intervened. He had claimed that when they went to pull them all down, they had likely missed my station. Problem resolved. The hiking season goes off without a hitch. I choose to join the speaker on another trip on the trail around a month after the snows finally start to melt. I have some equipment for overnight camping with me, and I intend to set up camp a little distance from my turning point. About an hour into the presentation, I almost missed the speaker. Now there is pure silence. I pause to give the electronics a little prod, but nothing immediately stands out as being incorrect. Over the winter, the brittle connections seem to have finally worn away. I keep walking down the trail. After around 2 hours, I've prepared a basic camp and pitched my tent. Since there are still a few hours of daylight left and it is late in the day, I choose to move ahead of my turnaround point for a little distance. I decide to take a short detour that climbs and may offer a pleasant view. I've only been walking for a little while when I start to daydream. I'm just enjoying the first warm weather of the year while basking in the late afternoon sun. I've chosen the ideal time to investigate. Wow, this is really nice. I have a thought. I then hear that recognizable, disturbing sound of chatting in the distance a short while later. My mind is still interpreting the noise as something harmless as I pause on the route. Even from a distance, I can hear that this sound is a little different and of higher quality than the first speaker. As I get closer, I have to stray from the track a bit in order to make out the words. I can clearly make out the words because the crackly sound is certainly lacking. Just as the dean described, it is the sound of a woman reading poetry. I choose to take a brief break by sitting on a rock close to the speaker, getting my water, and being less agitated than I originally was. As I sit there, I'm taking in the voice reading the well-known poems along with the sounds of the forest. But it's still a little unsettling, so after a short while I decide it's time to resume moving. I place my water bottle in my bag and get up to go. I then recognize the other voice. These insane, absurd remarks are being uttered nearby by someone. Curious but not yet terrified, I perk up. It has this odd, warbling sound in the wrong places, like the normal rise and fall of pitch in a sentence. Like when a sentence's random words are turned into questions. If you weren't alone in a jungle and far from help, you might giggle at the sound. As if turning a switch, the forest surrounding me falls silent completely. In front of me, the sound can be heard following through some dense vegetation. I'm completely motionless. Just taking in this insane noise, which sounds like a huge, bass-heavy baby voice under my breath, I say. What the hell? My meditation is interrupted as I catch a brief glimpse of something moving through the undergrowth. My animal instincts propel me rushing back toward the trail, slamming my conscious mind into the backseat. Before I even know what I was running from, I'm already careening back down the trail. Then it dawns on me. A wall of insight. A huge, towering cloud of unflinchingly frigid realization. I truly falter. My brain's neurons fire slowly. Just before the release, and then the fall, the ramifications are building in my head like a slowly condensing water droplet. I breathe out sharply and quickly as my chest constricts. A hand appeared. It seemed like a long, monstrous hand reaching through the undergrowth. To match that warped voice, a body. Then, directly behind me on the path, I hear it once more. It murmurs, "What the fuck?" Like it is experimenting with a new phrase that it has just learned. But it has this strange, beseeching aspect to it. Fuck. Running now? Suck suck suck. My feet are flying down the narrow wooded route in the sweltering late afternoon sun, scarcely touching the ground. As I carelessly and mindlessly rush along the trail, tree branches are slapping at me. The entire dash back to camp has me on pins and needles. I enter a clearing with my ears perked and chills all over my body before slowly making my way into camp with my palm delicately resting over my Bowie knife. Where the main route divides into several smaller tributaries, I can see my tent in the nearby tiny clearing. The tent is partially open and is positioned in the shade. I halt and linger over it. Packing things up would take roughly 10 minutes. I think about it for a brief moment. Nope. I'm back on the main trail and moving once again. I'm maintaining a steady jog, but after a few minutes, I come to a stop because I hear something new. I don't hear anything. A silence that is deeper than anything else. No distant birds, no leaves are rustling. No gentle wind or crickets. There is only total, strange silence that is almost stifling. It feels like a huge glass jar has been dropped all around me. There is a thick layer of woodland sounds one moment, and the next, thump. I am in a void. I shiver. I can hear my heart racing, but aside from that, I am as motionless and silent as the trees surrounding me. On my perspired skin, the air feels hot, motionless, and dead. Like being in a deserted attic in the summer. My mind wanders to a strange idea. I had the feeling I shouldn't move. People frequently have the impression that they are being watched, but this isn't quite the same. Not at all like being observed. It feels as if I'm being scrutinized. Additionally, my gut is telling me to blend in and follow the lead of the insects, birds, and trees. Wait and be still as a board. Take their lead. You don't run away from this. Follow their lead to survive. I therefore wait. In the middle of a step and a breath, frozen in an awkward position. not even blinking or looking around. I gaze through the wooden slats like a store mannequin in the closet as something dreadful peers back at me, attempting to determine whether I am a real mannequin or just a pretender. This force and I exchange that kind of stare for 10 seconds. The fear is making my brain spin. For 20 seconds. My heart is racing frantically, and my lungs are begging for air. It still looks at me. The look is abruptly interrupted. Its attention is elsewhere. The need for oxygen in my brain causes my vision to become as little as a pinprick. I hear rustling leaves in the distance. It approaches me so slowly. Not a creature's rustle, but a huge, communal exhalation from the forest. Once more, the sound of the jungle sweeps past me. I crouch down, place my hands on my knees, and add a heaving gasp of my own. The rest of the journey back is spent in a state of tense terror. Although I try to maintain a forced calm, I jump at every twig that snaps since I know I can't run forever. I set my speed for 2 hours into the early evening at a vigorous hike. By the time I return to my land, it is beginning to grow dark. My friends are all slack-jawed and motionless at the bar. After 5 minutes, no one has touched their beverage. I carelessly run the fingers of both hands through my hair while my entire body trembles. I felt as though I were looking down a gun's barrel. A gun that I couldn't see, but I knew was there, and I knew that if I had even twitched, I wouldn't still be alive. I would have been detected by it. It would have realized that I was real. I add, taking a sip of my beer and observing my companions' shocked, distant faces, and I never went back for that tent. My attempt to lighten the mood is met with a few hesitant, half-hearted chuckles, but aside from that, nobody seems very interested in anything but their drinks, the table, or the floor. Finally, one of them says, "Shit, man." "Yeah." I then retort, "Yeah." Until we settle our tabs and leave the pub, we're all remarkably silent and uncommonly reflective. On the way out, one of my friends approaches me and queries, "Was that actually accurate?" "Everything, I simply squint while gazing up at the starry Alaskan sky." I eventually find the words I'm seeking for. Nobody can explain some of the crap that is out there. Things that have no names, and I believe that occasionally, someone will come across one. The fortunate ones, like myself, who are intelligent, get to share their story. He gives me one more long look before nodding and heading toward his car, as though satisfied with my response. "Night," he replies. "Night," I utter. Naturally, I don't let him know there's more. I don't tell him that the thing that was looking me down in the woods was a monster rather than some ethereal, invisible force. Lanky, hideous, but somehow human-looking thing. Although it had a man's shape, it was not a man. That day, God gave me 2 gifts. One was keeping the beast out of my field of vision, and the other was saving my life. After that encounter in the jungle, I worked non-stop on my studies. I learned about the mutilated body the police discovered in the woods and the missing homeless man. Nonetheless, pieces of a corpse. I also learned about a group known as the Akadexidi. My meeting with the grandson of the shaman who urged the university to remove the speakers came about as a result of a follow-up call to the dean from the neighboring university. He and I met the following day. I'm not sure how well I can describe it. My perspective differs from that of my granddad. Mel claims. I eagerly follow up immediately. Try me. Are you aware that nearly all living things share some DNA? Like how we all share a common ancestry if you go back far enough. Even completely unique things like bacteria. I don't believe the Akadexidi are included in that family tree, though. I believe they originate from somewhere else. He sort of waffles, possibly anticipating my doubts. Possibly 2 days ago. He is unaware that I have strong reasons for not being a skeptic, though. These things aren't a joke. With his fingers encircling a frappuccino, he informs me. People at the campus think my granddad is nuts. Only because of his reputation in the tribe did they pay attention to him. But despite their affection for him, the majority of the tribe also believes he is crazy. Do you believe he is insane? I query him. Regarding the Akadexidi? He appears solemn, and I'm surprised by his sudden seriousness for such a young man. Although he appears to be somewhat casual, the weight of his gaze suggests wisdom beyond his apparent age. No. He is not insane. Because I witnessed one, he is not insane. I was maybe 13 at the time, which was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was riding my ATV through the woods, weaving in and out of them as I went too quickly. I was a foolish child back then. I made a lot of bad decisions. Anyhow, I'm in these really open forests where it's simple to see far away, and I spot this animal lying down there. I turn my ATV to approach and can immediately identify it as a deer. I cut the engine as I approach it and simply roll to a stop about 20 feet away. Because its back legs aren't moving and it is moving by using its front legs, I believe it may be wounded or suffering from some other condition. I go to get my knife thinking I'll have to murder it. This thing's head just snaps towards me as soon as I reach down. And by that, I do not mean that it made a sound, looked around, and then turned to face me. It suddenly jerked its head in my direction. He is obviously choking a little since he is clearing his throat. It didn't appear to be right. It seemed as if someone attempted to create a deer but lacked all the necessary components. It was twisted and gangly, glaring at me with those vile, bulging eyes. And I had the impression that it was attempting to understand who I was. Trying to identify who or what I was. Absolutely still. And a few seconds later, it simply turned and continued to drag itself away. I exclaim, "Wow," in wonder. I pushed my ATV back to the home as quickly as it would go. My grandfather first explained the Akadixidi to me at that time. They are evil spirits that spawn deep in the forest, he claimed. They are drawn to living things. Noise, sight, and other like things. When they come across something living, they sort of imitate it, but not before disassembling it. After copying anything, they look for more to improve upon their copy. I'm not exactly sure why. Simply put, he told me this. They are typically not harmful. The shaman go out and take care of it when one occasionally manifests as a dog, deer, or other animal. What happened to the person you saw, then? They ventured outside in search of a real deer. Once caught, they delivered it to the Akadixidi. Making them duplicate something that is already dying is the only method to make them die. We forgot about our drinks and sat there in silence for a while. I observed one. "What?" With amazement, he says. "And I believe I understand why your grandfather requested that the speakers be removed. What he was scared about actually occurred." "Wait, go more slowly. What are you referring to?" "There is an actual human Akadixidi somewhere. We arrive at the trailhead behind my property a few hours later. There is now just about an hour or so of actual daylight left until it gets dark. Nearby, a group of shaman from Mel's tribe can be heard conversing quietly with one another. About a dozen ladies and kids can be seen behind them, some of the women are sobbing. "What's going on, Mel?" I ask in hushed tones, but he beckons for me to wait while the shaman's circle disperses. Mel's grandfather, an older man in his early 60s, approaches us as we approach the trailhead. He passes us on the route without speaking to us, he just nods his head in our general direction. Despite his advanced age, he exudes a wiry kind of strength, and the war paint and feathered clothing he is wearing give him a threatening appearance. As he moves, I can see a decorative stone dagger on his belt. Then I start to speak. "When is he returning?" Mel simply gives me a glum expression. "He won't be returning." Then, Mel's earlier comments resound in my ears. Making them duplicate something that is already dying is the only method to make them die. My mother used to tell me every Tuesday and Friday when she took me yard zolling, "One man's garbage is another man's treasure," she declared. Back when I was younger, every summer. I have to confess that looking at what other individuals had for sale was somewhat interesting. Back then, I received several extremely wonderful toys. G.I. Joes. Legos. One day, I even discovered a full robots game. It's still in my closet upstairs. I adore that sport. Anyway, Mom used to discover some great things as well. Purses. Shoes. Knickknacks. Mom stuff, you know. She used to buy things for Dad as well. As I became older, we started going shopping, as my mother termed it, in addition to Tuesdays and Fridays. We used to go around the neighborhood in Dad's vehicle every Sunday night, the night before garbage pickup. Dad stayed at home because shopping wasn't exactly his thing. To see what people were discarding in their trash, we would drive around town in Dad's pickup. Dressers. Tables. A bed frame. Various things. Some of it was in fair shape, some needed some minor repairs, and some of it was pure garbage. The nice things that Mom and I brought home, Dad would refinish, and then they would either keep them or sell them at their own yard sale. It was an excellent method to earn extra money. As I grew older and became an adult, I continued the same lineage. Every chance I get, I go yard zolling, bring home furniture from the side of the road, and recently I've started exploring random wooded areas in search of new treasures. And I discovered one 3 months ago. No. I really did discover one. Well, the first thing I discovered made me unhappy. But what happened afterwards made me chuckle. You see, I had just left for home after work. For North Providence Telephone Company, I work as a linesman. Who is interested in that? Anyway, I was driving my old Honda home at the time. Further up the road, there was an accident that stopped all traffic. I had had enough of the heat because it was close to 100 degrees outdoors, my car lacked air conditioning, and I had spent the majority of the day outside. At the next crossroads, I took a gradual right turn into the road shoulder, something you really shouldn't do. Even though the trip home took longer and the air was still warm, at least I wasn't sitting still in it. Whatever the case, I stumbled to a group of trees that I had been meaning to visit but hadn't had the chance. It was a sizable forest area. What the hell, I thought as I walked up to it. I have nothing planned for tonight. Why not? So, just before the trees, I applied the brakes and parked the car on the grass. I shut off the automobile after putting it in park. Since I had no idea how long I would be inside and it would soon be becoming dark, I opened the glove box and took my flashlight out. I parked the car, locked it, and pressed the alarm button on my key ring. In this manner, when I'm done looking, I could set the alarm and perhaps hear the car beep, allowing me to locate it again by listening for the sound. Anyway, I entered and started to explore. The air had an odd thickness to it. In the trees, it was a little cooler but it was still really hot. After searching for around 30 minutes, I only came upon an old John Deere hat, a worn-out shoe, and a damaged pair of sunglasses. At that point, the sun had begun to set. I turned on my headlamp and kept scanning the area. I continued to wander for another 20 minutes without finding anything. The moment I was about to give up, I heard a disturbance to my right. I made a swift turn in that way. I thought I spotted someone standing by a tree for a brief moment. The figure vanished as soon as I blinked my eyes. Then I noticed it. At first, I had no idea what it was. It was large, I just knew it. I approached it while holding the light above it. God, oh God. A vehicle. No fucking way. I muttered to myself. How on earth did it enter here? The automobile was completely destroyed. The doors and seats were still in place despite having graffiti all over it, flat tires, broken glass, and numerous dents. Even though the seats were destroyed, they were still solid. The ignition still has the keys in it. Because of all the damage, I couldn't identify what kind of car it was. I walked past it nonetheless, nearly tumbling to the ground after tripping over a tree root. When I came to the passenger side, I unlocked the back door and peered inside with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything unusual. Mostly fast food containers, candy wrappers, and styrofoam cups. After opening the front door, I proceeded to the front seat and sat down there. There was nothing unusual about that either. A book of matches is on the floor, along with some used cigarette butts in the ashtray and a drink can in the cup holder. I'm not sure what told me to do it, but I was instructed to check the glove box. Then I did. When I opened it, the door, some used paper towels, ketchup packets, and a cassette tape bearing the words "Play Me" on it, inside a case made of transparent acrylic. Now, we've all seen the movie where the main character discovers a VHS tape with the same words in their new home's closet. When they play it, odd things start to happen. You are aware of what I'm referring to, right? In any case, I won't lie. I considered ending the conversation there because that movie completely terrified me out. But this was the most intriguing and amazing thing I've ever discovered. Screw that. I'll take it. I have an old boom box in the garage that can play this, I reasoned. Nevertheless, I took it, put it in my pocket, got out of the car, locked it, and pressed the alarm button on my keys. I then heard the car beep approximately 20 feet to my left, walked to my car, and then I drove home. I located the vintage boom box and played the tape. When I heard that, I couldn't believe it. I went ahead and verbatim transcribing the tape. I completed it in about a half hour. This is it. There are times in life when you simply grow weary of being who you are. Being who you really are. You then alter it. In other words, if you don't like your job, you may find another. Right? You change an aspect of oneself that you don't particularly like. Right? That's what I did, I suppose. For the first year or two, I had trouble. There was temptation waiting around every bend. Still, I did it. I had finally, in my mind, moved past my past. See, I've managed to keep the ghosts of my past at bay for the past 12 years. Prior to tonight. The events of tonight brought everything to the fore. Now, before I begin, allow me to briefly introduce myself. Dan is my name. Do it now. Laugh at me if you want. Dan the dork, I'm aware. Ha ha. Really humorous. You've got your fill of entertainment for the day, how about we move on? Now, Dan is an ancient Irish name, in case you didn't know. On my father's side, both my grandfather and grandmother were born in Ireland. About my second set of grandparents, I know nothing. Currently, my grandparents moved here, to the good old U, not long after their marriage. Of A. Most likely, my grandfather made the choice. Most likely, my grandmother had no influence on the decision. Back then, marriages were very different. Anyway, my grandfather obtained a position as an apprentice with a watchmaker here and, I believe, used the skills he had acquired over the years to create his own business. My grandmother's pregnancy was announced shortly after that. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the meaning of the phrase "with child," it simply indicates that the woman in question is pregnant. Anyway, 9 months later I gave birth to my father. At the age of 19, my father then wed Emily, a woman who was 2 years his senior. The pair was only married for a short period of time, 5 precise years, before divorcing due to irreconcilable issues. My mother and father only created one significant thing throughout those 5 years. Me. Despite being Irish, I don't have an accent. Now, after the divorce, I reportedly moved in with my father when I was 3 years old, and based on what I've learned from my investigation, I was sent to the Bennington School for Boys not long after because of unpredictable outbursts and behavioral issues. If you're curious, I did my own investigation on Ancestry.com to discover all of this. Almost nothing about my mother or father escapes my memory. I have no desire to want to know any of them after my father locked me in that god-awful dungeon and my mother essentially abandoned me, Anyway, when I was about 5 years old, I realized that I was, a special youngster. Unique. Yes, that is a suitable name for it. That's all I'll say about it. As you can probably already guess, I was quite the handful as a kid. Among other things, I would constantly pick fights that I would always win, hide food in my locker, and chew with my mouth open. Things that the school's leadership found to be quite concerning. In fact, I stood out from the other lads so much that I spent the majority of my time there in solitary confinement. My uniqueness was discovered by the authorities, and I learned shortly before my release that they believed it would be best to keep it under covers, so to speak, out of concern for a scandal. They just gave me crumbs and water to eat while keeping me locked away. Now, when I became 18, I was expelled from the boys' school and forced into adulthood with little more than a fundamental understanding of how to survive. I was detained numerous times for a variety of violations as my behavior pattern only got worse. When I was recently incarcerated, I met a man who had experienced a situation similar to mine but in a different way. He showed me how to restrain my impulses and channel them toward constructive activities rather than destructive ones. My life was totally altered by him. My urges remained strong after I was released from prison, though. Now, I must admit that in the beginning, I went off the wagon a few times, but I got back up and became the person I am now, or was. When I was 23, I started working as a busboy at Mary's, a small diner-style restaurant. Although it didn't pay much, it was plenty for me to rent a room at the neighborhood motel next to the restaurant. My wife and I met there. Not at the Flop House, but at Mary's. Anyway, I was packing away the plates and other items from one of the tables into a huge gray container. That evening, I was the sole busboy present. I was moving quickly since the other guy was calling out. Anyway, after cleaning the table, I immediately turned around and ran into her, causing her to scream and fall back on the table. I also dropped the tote, shattering all the glasses and plates. God, oh God. Are you okay? I quaveringly and anxiously questioned her. She then turned to face me and had the most stunning ocean blue eyes I had ever seen. Yes. I'm good. She grinned and added, you simply startled me. My apologies. I said while grabbing the tote. My employer is going to murder me. I murmured as 3 further girls passed by laughing. Allison, are you arriving or not? One of them uttered. I'll be there in no time. She smiled, waved, and mouthed bye to me in response. She then moved to sit down at the table with her pals. Even more embarrassing, I had to pass their table in order to get to the kitchen area and drop off my tote. I inhaled deeply, exhaled quickly, and started to move. Go for it, Allison. I overheard one of the females telling them as I passed their table. He's adorable. Then they all started to laugh. I went into the kitchen and informed my supervisor of what had happened. All she did was chuckle. She added, we have plenty more in storage. I grinned before returning to my job. I was removing another table about 45 minutes later when Allison approached me. Hi. Allison here. I'll give you my number, she said. Dial me, while presenting me with a folded napkin. Dan here. I answered, I will. Dan. Cool name, she exclaimed. She then waved, grinned, mouthed bye once more, and moved away. Just as she was about to walk out the door, she turned around and waved once more. The following day, I called her, we began dating, and a year later, we were wed. I apologize for rambling, I just enjoyed to share that particular tale. As I already mentioned, we got married a year later. Until I had enough money to afford an actual apartment, we lived in a small basement flat with her parents. We had a boy as our first child 2 years later. We gave him the name Stephen. We then had our second kid, this time with twins, 2 years later. A girl. We chose the name Kylie for her. I acquired a car during that period and was promoted to host, which earned significantly more than busboy. Allison obtained employment as a librarian's assistant and acquired a vehicle. With 2 children in all, we gradually saved what little money we could and eventually purchased a modest ranch-style home in the town with 3 bedrooms. Everything was going well. My wife and I had 2 fantastic children, a lovely home, and a good-paying job. I was also married to a woman who was breathtakingly gorgeous. Before tonight. Everything went south tonight. The phrase "the road to hell is paved with good intentions" is unquestionably accurate. My motives were honorable. I did everything I could to defend my wife and my family. But in doing so, I unintentionally created the mental hell I'm currently in. See, we had dinner and a movie for family night out last night. I drove as we borrowed her car. The keys to our respective autos are in our possession both. Anyway, after watching Shark Boy and Lava Girl in the theater, we had dinner at Texas Roadhouse. Everyone was enjoying themselves greatly. We made a gas stop en route home. I don't enjoy letting the tank get down to a quarter, so we might not have made it home. Stopping to get petrol is a choice I now regret making. To the pump, we pulled. The kids wanted to explore while Allison had to use the restroom. Thus, we all entered. For everyone, I held open the door. The children went first, followed by Allison and me. The kids rushed to the food aisle, Allison hurried to the restroom, and I proceeded to the counter to make my purchase. Why didn't he just use his debit card at the pumps? I know what you're asking. That's because I don't have one, I guess. I'm not a fan of banks. I don't need anything if I can't pay cash for it. Nevertheless, after a short while, the cashier completed serving the person in front of me, and then it was my turn. The door chimed, and a deep masculine voice roared, "Everyone down on the ground, or you're all dead." As he fired 2 shots in the ceiling just as I was about to say, "I need 30 on 5. My children started to wail. I yelled, "Get down." As I whirled to my right, those urges began to grow, and I felt them. When I turned around, a handgun's barrel was directly aimed at my forehead. He said, pressing the barrel against my skin, I said, "Get down. Hand me the cash." He yelled to the cashier, and then there was the sound of him fumbling with the register. I did nothing but stand there, unafraid at all. "I'm not going to ask," he started. I was about to finish when I heard Allison yell from the back of the shop. The man then pointed the rifle at Allison while turning it away from me. "Come on over, bitch," he yelled as he started to approach her with his rifle up and pointed. Now, it's one thing to point a pistol directly at my face, it's quite another to threaten my wife with one. Turning to face the clerk, I said in a low voice, "Get down, and stay down." Those urges I indicated before, though, they did really surface. My eye sockets shifted, and redness began to obscure my vision. I could feel my entire muscular system and skeletal structure changing into who I really am. As it swelled to cover my entire body, thick black hair started shredding my garments as it pierced my skin. My teeth and nose were swapped out with a long, gated snout. The top of my skull became home to my ears. My hands and feet turned into talons. I stooped to my knees and growled, sending chills down my spine. It only took a few seconds to fully metamorphose. Then, as I jerked back, the guy turned around. As I lunged on him, he fired his final 4 shots right into my chest, which caused him to drop the gun. The bullets had no effect. They weren't even painful. A werewolf can only be killed by a silver bullet. Anyway, in one bite, I took off his entire face. There was blood all over. I started pulling apart every part of his body. Then, I heard Allison yell. She had a look of panic on her face as I stood and stared at her. I moved past the bloody, disfigured body and moved in her direction. "Leave me alone. You evil one. Kids, don't look," she yelled. "Move along." She gathered the children in an instant, raced screaming out the door. I was limited to observing. Before they went, I ran into my kids. My children are looking at me with fear. Never would I harm my wife or children. Ever. I was keeping them safe. I quickly changed back and hurried to the door where I saw Allison and my kids leaving the petrol stations. My heart was utterly torn apart. I was defending you, I was. I hung my head and muttered, I was guarding you. I said with tears in my eyes. Then I heard distant sirens blaring. The cashier was behind the counter when I looked up and noticed her. He indicated the back. Go to the back exit. As the sirens grew louder, he said. In an effort to locate Allison and the kids, I dashed out of the back door and sprinted the more than 10 kilometers to our house. However, they weren't. Her entire wardrobe as well as the children's clothing was gone. The living room's wall-mounted print of our wedding was shattered, with the pieces ending up on the floor. I felt a small part of myself die when I saw that. I knelt down and sobbed for what seemed like hours. Then I stood up and made my way to our bedroom. The only item my mother ever got me was this, so I went over to my dresser and took it out. A little box in black. You'll know when you have to use this, she told me as she handed it to me outside the courthouse, stroked my hair, and then she left. I hadn't seen her since then. I didn't comprehend back then, but I do now. You see, there is a silver bullet inside the box. For all these years, I kept it. I removed the bullet from the box, picked up the pistol from next to it, opened the cylinder, put the bullet inside, shut the cylinder, and spun the gun. I then drove with my gun in hand after walking to my car. Someplace. Even now, I have no idea where I am. Somewhere among several trees. I feel the weight of this rifle in my hand. Now that I know what to do, I simply cannot bear the idea that my one and only real love considers me to be a monster. The image of the fear on the faces of my lovely children is one I can't bear to think about. I'm going to locate a beautiful, cozy area that faces east, wait for the sun to come up, Allison loved to see the sun come up, and then fire this bullet. The automobile is available to whoever discovers it. The title already bears my signature. In the hopes that whoever finds this tape will spread the word about my experience as widely as possible, I'm recording this on a portable tape recorder that I'll toss out the window when I'm finished. Perhaps Allison, Tim, or Kylie will overhear it and realize that I was merely attempting to keep them safe. I apologize. I sincerely apologize. I cherish you, Allison. Tim, I adore you. I cherish you, Kylie. Goodbye. The tape comes to a stop there. Now, I won't deny that when I first heard it, I cried. I made a call to a friend of mine whose dad has a towing company and an auto repair shop. I had the automobile towed to their shop by him. I fashioned a cross out of 2 old planks I had lying around the yard, painted it white, and inscribed the word Dan before planting it where I discovered the automobile after it had been towed. I did the best I could considering I don't know exactly where he passed away. Nearly 20 feet from the automobile, I also discovered a broken portable tape recorder. It was saved, and I placed it in the glove box. After doing some research, I learned that a suicide had occurred in those woods in 2003. According to police records, the victim's name was Dan Kelly, and the driver's license he had in his wallet served as proof. I spent every penny I had on the restoration of the vehicle, and to my surprise, it turned out that the enormous pile of rubbish was actually a 1960 Chevy Camaro hardtop. My ideal vehicle. I'm sure, right? They had to wait 2 months for it to be fully restored. As I'd always desired, I had it painted candy apple red with flames on the side. The DMV also gave me a vanity plate with the number 4 Dan written on it. Because I allowed him to use the before and after photos in his sales flyers, my friend's father gave me a discount. It has been my daily route for the past month or so. I gave the neighborhood Salvation Army my Honda. While they were repairing it for 2 months, I posted this tale on Facebook and Twitter and encouraged as many people as I could to listen to the audio, as Dan had requested. I so decided to share it here as well. I'll thank you, Dan, if you can hear me from wherever you are. You know, occasionally while I'm out and about, I swear, I catch a glimpse of someone sitting in the passenger seat who resembles the figure I first noticed in the woods when I discovered the car. But they're gone when I turn around. I can't help but believe it to be Dan. Now, I continue to pick up furniture on the side of the road and go yard selling because it makes me happy. But nothing gets me happier than taking Dan along for the ride as we travel down a back road while listening to music. Even though picking up dead objects is a disgusting method to get money, I didn't have any better options. When my cousin Bill told me about the occupation, I was living at his house after getting out of jail and waited for him to get annoyed with my scrounging methods. I had previously made a few half-hearted applications, partially to keep Bill happy and partly to appease my stupid fucking probation officer, but every time I checked the box that reads, "Have you ever committed a felony?" on the application, I knew that was it. Steve's Taco Emporium and bait shop or whatever bullshit job I was looking for wasn't returning my calls. I didn't get any calls at all. That's the problem though, they had you by a hair when they imposed a 5-year prison sentence on you. To survive, you must take any necessary action. Bill really pushed the roadkill job on me. He was very preoccupied with me getting paid. The actual benefit of cleaning up dead deer, Josh, you would tell me, is that no one cares about your shady legal history. All they are interested in is whether you travel out to pick up the dead deer from the county location after receiving the call. If you succeed, you can choose your own hours and earn $40 per deer. But you have to pick up dead animals, don't you? Possibly touch them. We were on his porch outside. Sunday in the early spring. Bill didn't have work that day because he had moved on from picking up dead animals as a freelancer to working for the county doing snow removal and road maintenance, which meant no weekends for him. He said, "This would be the kind of job you wear gloves too." Man, I don't want a job where I have to wear gloves. I started a new beer. He kindly ignored the fact that I wasn't truly on my feet before I entered a 5-year bid for the manufacture/sale of controlled narcotics when he said, "It's a way to get back on your feet. You're welcome to use my old truck. If you put in good labor for a few months, you might be able to buy your own apartment or at the very least, your own beer. Which will be convenient because, if you keep drinking and eating my groceries all day, I'm going to kick you out." When he didn't laugh, I waited for him to do so before asking him when I could begin. The ensuing few months went smoothly. Most days I made at least $40 because there was usually a deer dead nearby. But typically, I grabbed 2 or 3. By performing the math, I won't offend either of us. It suffices to note that it typically covered a case of domestic. Nevertheless, there were a few issues. Some of the issues were common, logistical in nature. Bill's truck wouldn't start, I didn't have enough money for petrol, and my probation officer was an asshole. But others were a little stranger. The stranger occurrence was that every once or twice a month I would receive a call reporting a dead deer, but when I arrived, there would be nothing there. The strangest part. It always happened in the same spot. The same time every time. Right before it merges onto 74 Frost Road. Always at noon. I initially believed I was mistaken, confused or anything, but it kept happening over and over. Dead buck, missing deer. A deer was never present. Perhaps a few of them were recently killed, and someone else simply picked it up. A month of free beef. I'm not a judge. But that's not how it actually felt. Every time I drove there, something seemed off. When I'd out, the air would smell odd, like though a storm was approaching, but there wouldn't be a cloud in the sky. There was improper pressure. So when I received a text stating that a deer had been found dead on 74, I wasn't in a rush. No rush at all, in fact. The Blind Pig's owner/bartender Steve was a fan of barbecue and was also dealing with glaucoma, so I finished the beer I was drinking inside and made my way out to the parking lot. Bill's truck, which was a real piece of crap, was still mine to drive. A truly awful ride. The steering wheel trembled if he drove over 40, and half of the dashboard lights flashed on and off seemingly at random, but it was free and it worked. Like, I suppose, myself. I cranked up the radio as I drove it away under a clear sky. The local AM gospel channel was the only station available. As long as I Got Jesus was playing, so I sung along. 10 minutes later, I rounded a curve and, lo and behold, there was a deer where I had anticipated seeing nothing, despite the fact that a dead deer had been reported. I stopped and put my hazards on. They functioned, but only slowly and mainly on one side. Superior to nothing. When I exited the truck, I rapped my knuckles. For that time of year, the morning was warm. Dandelion seeds in the air in the early spring as the surrounding forests begin to regreen after the winter. The forests were enormous on both sides of the road in this area of town. Public lands. There was no end to it. You were doomed if you got lost out there. In those forests, nobody ever goes missing and is ever found. I slipped on my thick work gloves before exiting the truck. There was no one else driving. At 10 in the morning, nobody is leaving for lunch because everyone is either at work or in class. I assumed that the rest of the population was beginning to day drink. I felt uneasy because of the void. I've been in some strange, awful, violent situations throughout my life, but the thing that always gives me the creeps is when a location that ought to be busy is deserted. I inhaled deeply and moved toward the deer. I was against seeing it. I was angry to see it. Deer that are dead are disgusting. Even when you live in the middle of nowhere and are accustomed to seeing them on the roadways, it is still disgusting and depressing. They decay and burst in the sun in the summer, and they freeze on the median's dead grass in the winter. The entire journey to the body I continued to tell myself that I was doing a good thing, as I always do. The proper action. This deer needs to be removed so that no one can see it. No one desires to view it. And getting paid, I added. I must be paid. The deer appeared young. The body was twisted, covered in blood, and had an oddly angled skull. My stomach climbed into my throat as soon as I smelled it. I had to look aside while I collected myself. I closed my eyes, bit the inside of my cheek, and started counting backwards from 10. I opened my eyes when I said 0, and that's when I first noticed it. Deer were in motion. Not the deer, please. It was still and still, but the skin's pulse suggested that a wave was trying to emerge from beneath it. I took a step back and peered. I was curious if that was a twitch. Sometimes, doesn't the body continue to move after death? I gave the deer a close inspection. Nothing. Nothing at all moved. Just roadkill. Uncontrollable twitch, I determined. Not another. I slid my shovel under it while bending over. It jumped. I yelled and threw it back on the floor. I stumbled backward, stopping only when I ran against Bill's truck's front. My knees were weak and rubbery, and my chest was fluttering up and down. The frozen corpse sagged to the ground. I grabbed my phone and dialed Bill's number. Josh, how are you? Man, what the F is wrong with this deer? I started at an 11 out of 10 and came in really hot. What are you discussing? When I'm not there to witness the fucking deer, how am I meant to know what the fuck is wrong with it? I was pacing and giving it a wide distance while saying, "It's moving, guy. It is in motion. Are you certain it is deceased?" I halted and hung up the phone. After pausing to look at the body for a while, he nodded and raised the phone once more. "Yes, it is deceased. As bad as dead. Do you believe I am a fool? Dead creatures typically don't move. I'll give you another FaceTime call. You should see it." I dialed his number again and turned the display to the dead person. "It isn't moving," he declared. "I know. It's not now. When I took it up, though, it moved. Put the phone down so I can watch your dummy pick it up once more." I set the phone against a boulder and placed it on the ground. Where I had left it was where the deer was. My heart was thudding as I knelt down. The air had died, and the woods appeared to be silent. Bill yelled, "Pick it up." I shouted back, "I'm about to." Long breaths. I got close to it. Through my heavy-duty work gloves, I swore I could feel the warmth of it. Up until Bill yelled again, I remained still. I muttered as I raised it. Deer often weigh 130 pounds. They must be supported somewhat by your body. Bill was shouting and I was trying not to breathe while deer blood and guts were getting on my shirt and my arms. There was nothing moving. It was just something dead. However, there were suddenly way too many fucking flies that hadn't been there before, like an army of them buzzing, and over them I could hear Bill shouting, telling me that there was nothing wrong with the goddamn deer and that he had to return to work. He was accurate. There was no issue. Something existed, but not right now. I put the deer in the truck bed and headed to the disposal area. The customary location was only a few miles outside of the town and very close, but as I was starting the car, I received a text. Said that the garbage site had a new location. It sent me an address that was in the west, which was in a different direction. The subdivisions and fake-ass mansions were out past the new target, where everyone drove SUVs and their kids all bought narcotics from guys like me. This address went above and beyond. The ancient woods, where nothing had ever been constructed. Hills, woods, and winding roads are everywhere. Every 10 miles there is a driveway, but the houses are hidden from the street. I turned along one of those deserted-looking driveways as instructed by the GPS and continued on. I was in front of an old cabin when I eventually decided to halt. It appeared as though it had not been used for years. On the roof, there was a lot of mold, and one of the windows was damaged. I noticed a corroded old pole with tiny threads tied around in the backyard. Like everything else there, it seemed deserted. I blew my horn, then parked. I was still not feeling well from whatever had happened, but I was making an effort to ignore it. In a pit behind the cabin, a fire was blazing. At least someone must be present. When I went outdoors, the smoke from it touched me. Screaming birds were heard in the treetops. "Hello, is anyone around?" I yelled. "Got you guys a deer." Zero reaction. I turned my head to the rear of the vehicle. Deer was still present. I had no idea where I imagined it may have gone. The flies from before appeared to still be present, swarming around. Dense cloud. They covered the truck in a cloud-like swarm. I could only hear a faint buzzing. Some impacted my face. I put one disgustedly in my mouth and spit it out. I couldn't see the deer for a brief period of time due to the insects, which I suppose explains what happened next. Do you recall those photographs that appear one way, but change into a different image when a translucent colored piece is placed on top of them? The flies appeared to be a sheet of paper covering the deer. The deer was a dead doe when they arrived. The animal had horns and its eyes were wide open after the flies swarmed. When the monster opened its jaws, its teeth weren't the white tic-tacs of non-meat-eating animals that are flat and round. Instead, they were violently sharp and ready to bite. I stumbled backward. I shut my eyes. I could hear buzzing in my ears. All over my body, I felt little, hairy insects. Even though I wanted to scream, I refrained from doing so that I could shed the noise and slap at the flies in a blind manner. I slid my eyelids open. The flies had vanished. I moved closer and peered inside the cab. The deer was once more dead inside. It had lost its horns. I urged you to enter the truck. Drive the fuck away after getting in the truck. Never return. However, get rid of the goddamn deer first. The deer was mine once I reached inside. It had warm, supple skin. It moved when I touched it. But my stomach grumbled. I grit my teeth. I told myself, once you get it out, throw up. Avoid puking in the midst. Complicates things way too much. I drew the animal close to me and inhaled its sickly fragile death perfume before lifting it and turning around. 50 to 60 deer were standing 20 feet in front of me. The midday light made their eyes shine. Odd eyes that are bright. Instead of the black I was expecting, there was silver, like if quarters had been polished and then stuffed into their eye sockets. Their brown bodies were in close proximity to one another, as though they were a bizarre, living wall. When I opened my eyes again after closing them, they remained closed. When they opened their mouths, all I could make out were the razor-sharp points that should have been their teeth. A voice said, "Bring the body." I glanced, but no one was there. "Bring it closer to the flames." The voice had an odd tone. "Wrong." A recording grew slower. Reading words that they had never said was someone who did not speak English. Perhaps something vocalist had said it. There was a gap between the deer, almost like a path. The path directly went to the fire pit. I started to move through. I sensed their gaze upon me. Their breathing was audible. It didn't sound the way I expected it to. Smooth white stones encircled the fire pit and appeared to glitter in the heat. It grew hotter the closer I got. My clothing was saturated in perspiration. The deer's weight pressed up against me, and I felt the heat from the pit and the animal's flesh. I wondered why it was so hot. It must be dead. Was it? I'm positive I felt it move. I experienced waves of nausea once more, but I knew I had to continue. This had to be done. The buck was raised above my head. The forest's natural sounds came to an end. I included it. I could hear the deer cry as soon as they landed on the flames. I knelt down and covered my ears, attempting to block out the terrible screeching while remaining still. It sounded like machinery being operated incorrectly, as if the engines had been taken apart and reverse assembled before everything was pushed up to the maximum. Everything was painfully high-pitched. I heard my name among all the commotion. I opened my eyes after they had been closed. As the flames tore the deer apart on the altar, I was directly staring at it. It had its mouth open, and I swear I could hear it whispering my name. The flames then grew more intense and the stench of burning skin and fur became intolerable. When I started to cough, the flames were considerably higher and the deer had reduced to a skeleton. When I turned around, every deer was gone. I stumbled over to the car and climbed inside. I continued to grip the driving wheel and scan the rearview mirror. Just woods and smoke. There are trees everywhere. I started driving a little unsteady at first, but I continued going. When I spotted a sign for the booze store, I was traveling 20 miles over the speed limit. Before I even returned to Bill's house, I applied the brakes, stepped inside, bought a bottle of their cheapest vodka, and started drinking. I called the county the following day, groggy, and asked them to remove me from the list of roadkill. Sure, they answered, but they questioned why I hadn't brought the deer in yesterday. I claimed to have taken it to the new location. I remained silent regarding what had transpired. My throat tasted like metal, and my head was throbbing. All through the night, I had visions of things in the woods, burning houses, and partially dead things. They then informed me that there was no new website. Same location as before. They questioned me, "Where did you take it, sir?" As soon as I hung up, I swear I could still hear the deer's never-ending screams over the static of the dead line. The creature of the night, fully attuned to the environment and low light conditions, sniffed in short, quick bursts to check his surroundings. The nose was pushed high in the air. Well-developed nostrils inhaled deeply and blew air from the slits beneath them, which stimulated the olfactory senses to make the creature aware of all around it. One ear rotated to the right as it detected a sound in the tall grass. The other ear faced forward. The eyes, which reflected the full moonlight above, were laser-focused on one instinctual urge. I held my breath, waiting for it to make a move. This was the moment I had waited for more than 20 minutes. Pico, a well-adjusted 5-month-old chocolate lab puppy, cocked his leg and urinated on the fire hydrant. His eyes remained focused on the squirrel, which had descended the massive oak tree to fetch a midnight snack in the tall grass just off the sidewalk. This was the first time Pico had ever cried to go outside to use the bathroom, a good sign his potty training was coming along. He kicked and tore at the grass near the hydrant with his back feet until I tugged at the leather leash for him to cease. He wagged his tail as I groggily administered a pat on the head and a treat to reward the behavior. I yawned deeply and checked my phone. It was just after 11. I had to be awake for work in 7 hours. Come on, Pico. Time for bed. Again, I rubbed him behind the ears and began the walk back home. The park at the edge of my neighborhood was beautiful and cared for by the city. Elegant street lamps, created to match the image of old oil lamps, illuminated the pathways for safe traversing even in the dead of night. My neighborhood, known as Millennium Park, sat just off the edge of downtown proper. Just over 100 two-story homes full of families lined each street, nestled between rows of ancient oaks which were never cut down when the city was built. The cool breeze of autumn ripped through the forested park around me. A mountain of orange and red leaves cascaded down around me. Pico did battle with one as it tumbled down onto his nose, until he tripped over his own feet and cartwheeled onto his stomach. I couldn't help but smile as he looked back at me in confusion. I passed a park billboard, nothing more than cork and a wooden frame. I examined the warnings and photographs tacked and stapled around it. Unsure of if the breeze or the sight caused me to shiver, I turned away. Over the last 6 months, 3 children and more than a dozen pets had gone missing in Millennium Park. It started with David Murera, a 9-year-old boy who disappeared in his own backyard. A month later, 2 twin girls and their pug vanished from their backyard during an evening barbecue. Every month, someone or someone's pet went missing. 4 cats vanished in one evening. The fact that every disappearance occurred on the night of a full moon led to the locals dubbing the incidents the full moon murders, even though no body had been found up at that point. That is, until little Michael Mitch Dobbin turned up. Mitch was found 7 feet off the ground, wedged between the branches of a birch tree where the park abutted Saunders Street. His liver had been ripped from his body and the corpse mangled beyond all recognition. He was only identified after his mother located his ID and a kid card for a fingerprint match. The brutality of the kill had shocked the city and gave the parents of the other missing children less hope for a safe return. And yet here I was, on the full moon, walking my dog while I scrolled on my phone. But I was an adult, not a child, and certainly not an overweight house cat locked outside in the night. Still, the thought of those poor kids all missing after so much time disturbed me. I stepped awkwardly as I stared down at my phone and tumbled off the concrete sidewalk. I landed directly on my butt. Pain radiated up my back as I jammed my coccyx and wrenched my hips at an awkward angle. Pico stopped and looked back at me, then trotted over to nudge my hands. I looked around to make sure no one saw my embarrassing gaffe, then remembered the time. A chilly breeze crinkled the leaves on the ground and caused the skin of my left elbow to sting. I raised it up but felt the warm trickle of blood before I saw it. Pico bounded around me, making sure to nudge and lick at my fingers. "I'm okay, Pico." "Really?" "Cut it out," I told him, but knew I couldn't be mad at him for checking on my safety. I stood up cautiously and stretched my body at the hips. I tried to pat the very good boy on the head, but he continued to bob and weave. Pico's ears nipped straight up, and he suddenly ceased all movement. His entire body became rigid, and he stood in front of me, fur erect. He lowered his head and tucked his tail between his legs. He stared intently across the open expanse of the park into the swirling blackness of night. The breeze blew directly into our faces as Pico froze in place. We were downwind of something he didn't like. "What is it? What do you see?" Pico whimpered and retreated towards me. He pawed me to pick him up. I narrowed my eyes to gaze beyond the sidewalk, where the warm embrace of the street lamps could not reach. At first, I could see nothing. The darkness enveloped everything in a smothering coil. Then I caught movement. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first. But the more I stared, the more I realized it indeed was someone walking across the field. No, not a someone. It was something. It was slumped low, slinking like a beast. My blood ran cold. I was being stalked. I couldn't make out what the form was, but it moved carefully and slowly, with precise, delicate motions. Pico cowered and growled weakly. I quickly checked the distance between the thing in front of me and the path to the stone bridge which led to the park's exit. I scooped up the little puppy in one arm and made a break for it. In full sprint, I didn't dare look back as my mind raced with what it could be. Coyote, I thought. It had to be, but it looked much too big. Bears had been seen in the area, frequently migrating between the mountains and the coast. Was I being attacked by a black bear? I reached the bridge and stopped to catch my breath under a street lamp. The creature was still there, maneuvering from one shadow to another. It was smart, very smart. I was less than a block from my home. I ran as quickly as I could to the street. I heard the soft pitter-patter of bare feet on the pavement as the thing kept pace with me. I spotted my brownstone-style home, the warm, safe glow of my front porch lamp to guide me. I raced up the steps and inserted my key. Damn it. Wrong key. I fumbled to remove it as I looked back. The shadow was closing quickly. Pico, slung snugly over my shoulder, looked back at the incoming threat and cried incessantly. Shit, it was close. Why did I have so many damn keys on my ring? I found the correct one and pushed the door open, and practically fell inside. I kicked the door shut with my right foot as Pico fell onto the floor and scurried down the hall into the den. A loud thud echoed through the door as the creature rammed it. It really was after us. I couldn't believe it. My heart pounded through my ribcage. The full moon, which had shone brightly during the walk, was now covered by clouds. The interior of the home was shrouded in complete darkness. Bang! Another impact to the door. It groaned slightly. Bang! Another, and this time the door creaked as the wood weakened. Shit, shit, shit. It was going to break the door down. I heard metal being sheared apart. The creature rammed the door a fourth time, but this attack was much weaker. Had it injured itself? Bang! This one was soft, muted, and more like a dull thud. I waited for the next impact, but it never came. I sat motionless, in the black foyer of my home, scared to death. Knock, knock, knock. Hello, mister. The voice came meekly, like it was exhausted. Help me. It's cold outside. And real dark. The voice sounded like a child. I steadied myself on my feet and reached for the doorknob, hand trembling. The soft click of Pico's nails on the hardwood floors told me he was carefully creeping back towards me. I gripped the old brass knob and turned it slowly. I allowed the door creak open just a crack to reveal a small child, maybe 5 years old. He was naked, and covered from head to toe in dirt, grime, and filth. His matted hair clung to his head and neck. Some of his toenails were missing, and his hands were raw and bled openly. His arms were wrapped around his chest against the wind. I stared into those small blue eyes and suddenly my mind clicked. Joey Umstead. Oh my God. I exclaimed as I fully threw the door open. I had just seen his photograph on the board in the park. He had been missing nearly 6 months. He was the first. He stared at me with vacant eyes and shivered. I'm hungry, he said tiredly and rubbed his emaciated frame. I placed my left hand on the front door but recoiled quickly. Ouch. What the hell, I stuttered as I looked at the solid oak door. 4 deep gouges raked across the front, reaching corner to corner. Several smaller slashes ripped through the blue paint and deep into the untreated portion of the wood. The wrought iron railing which lined my stoop was bent and twisted like a pretzel. The damage was unfathomable. Pico crept to my heel and bowed his head, then began to growl viciously. His tail was tucked under his legs. I stared at him, completely perplexed. My dog cowered, a filthy missing child was at my door, and something had destroyed my front door. "Hey kid, did you see?" The clouds broke overhead, and the pale light of the full moon beamed down on my porch. The child twisted and convulsed violently. He let out a pained scream as his voice broke. He fell to all fours and pounded the concrete patio. I heard a deep, sickening snap. His shoulders rocked back and his hips jutted backwards. His bones were breaking. His fingernails fell from his hands and clattered against the cold concrete, but they were quickly replaced by massive claws. Little David Miura ripped the flesh from his naked torso in chunks. Pico trembled and peed himself. He tipped over and rolled down the 7 steps to the sidewalk. Massive gouts of blood poured from his body as large clumps of fur jutted viciously from his exposed flesh. His jaw dislocated as massive teeth pushed through the lips. I stood there, frozen in abject terror. His bones continued to break and pop, and he appeared to balloon in size right before my eyes. David reached up to his eyes with his gargantuan, swollen hands and peeled his face off from scalp to jawline in one clean swipe. He beat his head repeatedly against the cobblestone sidewalk, letting blood trickle into the gaps like little crimson rivers. Muscles twitched and ripped and healed as it continued to grow until the child was fully transformed. After a moment, the thing rose and turned to face me. I stared deep into the light blue eyes of an enormous wolf, or at least, what I could closely approximate to a wolf. It easily stood more than 6 feet in height. It was thinly built, but I could see long, sinewy strands of muscle tissue beneath the ragged skin. Mange riddled the creature, reducing what should have been a tick coat down to mottled mess of patches of brown fur. The monstrous canine bared its teeth and rotated its ears back. What little hair remained along the nape raised in a thick ridge between the shoulder blades as the tail extended straight out from the body. It stamped a hind leg against the stone sidewalk, tearing what used to be the skin of the child's face in two. "Fuck," I said to myself. I slammed the door shut and sprinted towards my kitchen. A terrifying bang rattled the frame of the house. I slid to a stop near my kitchen counter and peered down the hallway towards the foyer. The mammoth wolf was framed in the soft moonlight, his silhouette striking a nightmarish image. Pico quickly tailed behind me, quickly losing traction on the slick floors. It took a step inside my home, then another. The crushed door frame fell away as it wrenched the door free from the hinges and tossed it against the wall. I scrambled my block of knives. I yanked the largest one out roughly, which knocked over the entire block to the tiled floor. I quickly scooped up a steak knife and threw it like a ninja in an action film. It clattered uselessly against the floor. The wolf never flinched. It continued forward in a slow, methodical pace, clearly still healing from the transformation. The creature extended its right arm and dragged the nails against the wall of the foyer. They sliced through the walls easily. It continued forward and the talons cut into the old mirror which hung on the wall. The glass shattered and after a moment it recoiled in pain. It checked its paw and shook tiny flakes of metal from it. Anger seethed over its face and it regained focus on me. The kid did say he was hungry, I thought to myself. I checked my surroundings for a way out. The basement was a one-way ticket to certain death. The only way out was up. I slid over the island and raced for the staircase. The route took me within 2 feet of the monstrous wolf child, and it took a hard swipe at me with its deadly claws. They missed my head by inches, and I flew up the steps 2 at a time. I reached the upstairs landing and looked back. The wolf leapt the entire distance in one bound and smashed into the drywall beside me. It tumbled into the spare bedroom. I slid into my bedroom as a drawer from the spare room chest was launched in my direction. It crashed to the floor and spilled excess linens. The wolf ripped through the door in one powerful motion and tore through the tattered remains violently. I slammed the bedroom door shut, but I knew it was futile. The creature was impossibly strong, and it would take mere seconds to get to me. I caught a glance at the bedroom window. It was a long way down into the backyard and parking lot. I placed the knife down on the bedside table and tossed my lamp aside. I undid the locks and yanked the window up. I felt the buzz of my mobile phone in my front pocket. I fished for it instinctively like a dumbass. "Hey Brad, now isn't a good time," I said breathlessly. "You okay over there, buddy?" "Sounds like a brawl for all in the house," my neighbor said suspiciously. I hung up on him and grabbed the knife as the bedroom door was hacked at. 4 long, jagged nails ripped through it with ease, slashing a set of 2-foot gashes into the wood. The wolf's stare burned a hole into my brain as it hungrily set its sight on me. The doorknob fell limply to the carpet below and rolled aside. The creature gently pushed the door open. There was nothing between us but 15 feet of carpet and open air. This was my only chance, I thought. Bark, 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 bark. Pico. I had forgotten him in my rush to get away. He stood defiantly behind the wolf, verbally berating it for the intrusion. Large globs of drool poured from the open jaws of the wolf as it set its sights on my little puppy. Pico recoiled in fear and backed down the hallway towards the landing. He fell down the staircase hard, tumbling head over tail until he crashed on the floor. I leapt at the opening and plunged the kitchen knife into the back of the wolf. The blade sunk deep into the flesh. It didn't even flinch. It turned its head and glared at me menacingly. My eyes bulged from their sockets as I realized I had only made it angry. Thinking on my feet, I quickly removed the blade and began to stab the wolf in the back repeatedly. Large sprays of blood crisscrossed the room. Finally acknowledging my attack, the creature backhanded me with its left paw and I crumpled against my bed. Pico took flight down the stairs. The wolf approached me and towered over me. I regained my composure as best I could, even though I felt like I had been smacked in the head by a heavyweight boxer. Scrambling over my bed, the wolf slashed at the mattress just a foot from me. It traversed the frame in one leap and slammed into the headboard, fracturing it. I skidded along the carpet and slid across my bathroom tile. The monstrous wolf was in hot pursuit. I didn't even bother closing the door this time. The beast lost traction on the tile and ran headlong into the shower, crashing through the wall. I backpedaled for a moment. I realized the beast had gone completely through to Brad's townhome. I peeked through the massive hole but couldn't see any sign of the creature. Brad? You there? I stuck my head through the shattered drywall and toppled brick. Bits of insulation fluttered across the floor like tumbleweeds. Holy shit! I heard Brad scream from downstairs. An audible double bang shattered the eerie silence of the home as a shotgun discharged. Brad screamed, a horrible, blood-curdling scream. The scream was cut short by a long, baleful howl. Nope. Bye, Brad. Sorry, I muttered as I retreated back to my home. I hopped the staircase back to my den and scooped up Pico, who was crouched low behind the couch. Let's go, Pico. Time to leave. As I ran through the half-frozen kitchen, Pico in my arms, a flurry of leaves blew down the hall through my ruined door and frame. I stumbled to a halt in the hall as the wolf stepped into view on my sidewalk. It dragged a headless corpse by the ankle. Brad. His entrails had become extrails, dangling from his gutted torso across his chest. The monstrous thing stepped across the threshold again and pounced. It crushed me under its sheer weight. I held up my arms to defend myself as the gnashing teeth bore down upon me. It clamped down on my right forearm, separating the ulna and radius from the elbow. I thought I could hear the fascia tear away from deep beneath the flesh. I screamed in pain and made the terrible mistake of trying to pull my arm away. The teeth sunk in deeper, and the thing lifted me off the ground. It shook its head side to side, shaking me like a toy in the mouth of a vicious dog. It slammed me on the ground, and both sets of claws sunk into my back, tearing my skin. I laid on the ground, fully expecting to die. I saw my own reflection in the floor, albeit ruined and crooked. My eyes focused in and I realized I was staring at the broken shards of the antique mirror the wolf had damaged earlier. It had recoiled from the mirror when it scratched it. But why? The wolf released me from its grip and howled. The answer slapped me in the face as I saw the ruined piece of faded metal. Silver. Old mirrors were backed in a thin layer of silver. My trembling hand slid through the chunks of glass. I winced as they riddled my hand in cuts but grasped it eventually. I rolled over to see my attacker face to face. It snatched me up in both hands and lifted me high off the floor. I rammed the sliver of silver between the ribs, targeting where the heart on a human would be. The deep blue eyes widened in surprise and the beast stopped mid-growl. The skin sizzled around the wound. It gasped and gagged a bit but didn't release me. I removed the shard and stabbed the wolf repeatedly, like a shank in the side. Each new hole burned and smoked, and boiled blood fell out in chunky pieces. We both stumbled backwards out the door and tumbled down the staircase onto the sidewalk of my neighborhood. It released me, and I landed with a harsh thud on my back. The air was forcefully expelled from my lungs, and I gasped to regain my senses. The wolf landed beside me on its face, bleeding profusely. It whimpered quietly like a dog in pain. I crawled to the wounded beast. The feet feebly twitched and stopped. The distant wail of a siren resounded from somewhere in the distance. I closed my eyes for a minute. A horrible crunching sound began. I was exhausted, and I couldn't bring myself to open them. I gripped the shiv in my hand tightly but didn't think I had the strength to fight any longer. After a long 2 minutes, it ended. "I'm sorry, mister. I was hungry." I peeked through one eye to see I was starting at little David Murira. He was face down on the cold ground. His eyes were open, but he didn't move. A pool of blood formed around his body as he bled to death a foot from me. A screech of tires sounded somewhere nearby, but I faded to black, probably from blood loss. I woke up more than a week later in a hospital, handcuffed to a bed. I was angry at first, but I couldn't do much. A concussion, shattered forearm, and more than 100 cuts told me to stay put. After a day or so, I began to realize why I was cuffed to a bed. A missing child was found dead next to me, the murder weapon in my hand. Brad's headless corpse being nearby didn't help. But there were too many unexplainable things. The damage to my home, Brad's home, and the injuries. I lied my ass off. I told them I couldn't remember anything. They eventually released me, and I went to stay in a hotel. I picked Pico up from the animal shelter. He was so excited he peed on the floor when he saw me. That was where the excitement and happiness ended. The next day, he wouldn't come near me. He cowered in a corner and growled whenever I came by. No more cuddling. No more playing. No more going outside together. 3 weeks after the attack, I started eating my steaks undercooked. Last night, I had 5 raw chicken breasts. I took Pico to my parents' house and asked them to keep an eye on the little guy for a few days. No matter what I eat, no matter what I drink, I am constantly in pain. My stomach roils and groans for more. The full moon is tonight. I cleaned the entire fridge of everything edible. Please stay indoors tonight. I don't know what I will be forced to do to satiate the hunger.
There had never been a resident. At least, not that I could recall. I was 12, though, so that didn't really matter. I once asked my father about it, but nobody was home because we had only recently moved here. Dad and I had always been together since my mother died when I was a little child. He has 2 jobs and didn't seem really interested in my inquiries concerning the house. Most of the time, I was by myself and had to figure things out for myself. The for sale signs outside had changed as the seasons did. They would ultimately become worn down, removed, and replaced with fresh, vibrant ones. How wasteful! I never seen an open house, and I don't recall ever witnessing someone enter. Neither a contractor nor a real estate agent. The front of the house was even devoid of a number. Although I could roughly place it because it was located between 105 and 348 Charles Drive. I said there had never been a resident. It's true that nobody had. However, when I looked out of my bedroom window, I could see that was about to change. A sizable moving truck was parked in the neighboring home's driveway. A family was settling there. I kept a close eye on the 2 parents. Each time they passed each other carrying a fresh load from the truck, his hands would manage to make contact with her hips, thighs, or butt. She would laugh and lash back at him after that. Throughout the transition, they appeared to be showing affection for one another. It appeared that their daughter was their sole kid. When she noticed her parents getting close, she would whistle or catcall. Instead of laughing at them or grumbling, she encouraged them. They all appeared to be getting along well. Youthful, entertaining, and cheery. This close-knit family genuinely delighted in one another's company. What that would be like has always intrigued me. I became more fascinated on her the longer I gazed. She appeared to always be cheerful and was dressed in a sundress. She walked with the finesse of a ballerina, but her blonde hair bounced. She and I needed to speak. She and I had to talk. Prior to summoning the courage to descend and offer my assistance, I had been watching for nearly 2 hours. I reasoned that I could assist with hauling anything else that was needed. That would be useful, I believed. I may also continue to stand outside and simply assist. However, I didn't want to enter. That house has never had my faith. Because it had been so long since I had last seen something, each time I thought back, the images grew fainter and the memories grew further away. However, they were present between the time I was learning to ride a bike and when the same bike was taken. I was young the first time I can recall realizing something was amiss. And the recollection only exists in flashes for me, close to a whole roll, but not quite. I think I was around 4. Just before my mother died, I was in the backyard with her. There was a picnic going on. I recall the old red and white checker tablecloths that were set out, along with a wicker basket, some sliced oranges and little sandwiches. I had a watermelon in my mouth. Then I was left alone. I can't recall why. Mom might have used the restroom. But alone myself in the backyard. And heard a cry for help. It had the sound of dry, crackling leaves. I didn't want to go back. However, the voice cried out once more, this time louder. "Tom?" I followed the voice and turned around. It originated from the empty house next door, where nobody resided and I had never seen anyone. However, somebody was there. It was an elderly lady. She had tufts of curly hair that clung to the sides of her head. From the kitchen window, she was waving at me. She was grinning broadly. To the ear. It was oversized. It then turned frightening. Then her face, fell away. Like, the skin literally peeled off. She continued to smile. Mom then returned outside, and the elderly woman was gone. I kept turning around to look at the house, but she never came back. Mom responded that it was probably just a shadow when I told her. However, I never thought that. Shadows are not amused. Or make a hand motion. Or possess faces that can detach like in some bizarre magic act. You couldn't persuade me otherwise that day. I saw an elderly woman waving at me inside the house. It was time to go meet my new neighbor because it had been a while ago. As her parents maneuvered a mattress onto the driveway in the moving truck, Lindsay shouted instructions to her parents. I might be able to help with it. For some reason, I gave myself a final look in the mirror. Yes, I didn't change, I still looked the same. I wasn't able to accomplish anything at this time. I'd like to think that she'd still be curious. I walked downstairs and sat in the living room to observe. Lindsay was now alone herself at the truck while her parents carried the mattress. I put on my running shoes and sprinted to the front. I gave a warning sound with the crash of my screen door as I approached. Heard by Lindsay. She peered out the truck's window. Her face began to smile inquisitively. I abruptly uttered "Hey" as if it were the first time. She most likely believed that I didn't speak English. But she responded with a smile and a hello. She startled me when I noticed that, up close, she had a rugged appearance, as if she could climb trees, jump in quarries, and ride a bike without missing a beat. I had the impression that my dearest friend had moved in. The fact is that she had also set off a feeling in my heart that I could only assume represented love. She had a very laid-back, enjoyable, and adventurous air about her. When I regained consciousness, I saw that she was watching for my response. I had only recently met her when I first began to see our future together. "Sorry, I missed that," I mumbled. She questioned my name. We made our introductions. Lindsay was her name. Tom was me, and we were both happy to meet one another. She gazed at me across the fence between our homes as though she were my best friend and the most stunning woman I had ever seen. I was aware that I would be on the opposite side of the fence in a matter of seconds. I had no idea what to say and had completely forgotten to offer my assistance, so I just started babbling. As I had lived here my entire life, I assured her that I was familiar with the area. She asked if I could be her guide because she wanted to stretch the legs of the new bike her father had just bought her. To say yes, I stumbled at least 5 times. She had a certain quality that was simply seductive. I was unable to get over it. I wished I could sit next to her. As the wind picked up, I smelled her shampoo. It has heavenly and coconut scents. She asked if I wanted to help and then said she had to resume moving. I blinked. I imagined the neighborhood bike rides I take her on as I rounded the fence. I could take her to Whitehill Park's ravine, the quarry at Anderson, out to the former storehouse of the town's electrical and machine shop. She could want to see it all, I bet. My stomach then became foul. I could taste bile at the back of my throat for a little period of time. I reflected about the second time I had noticed something at the neighboring house. 3 years had passed since the backyard picnic. I was unhappy that Mom was gone and now furious because my bike had just been stolen. Since we had the funds to rapidly repair it, I had to walk everywhere until Christmas. The bike served as a means of transportation for me to get to areas that were so remote that I felt unlike myself. When I fitted bike cards to the spokes, it happened quickly and with the ideal clicking sound. I traveled the world on that bike. I could be exploring different areas of the city in less than 20 minutes and already feel at home there. I might not even be me. An excellent student. The team's soccer captain. 2 devoted parents. A mom. A sibling. A young person who admired me. He could learn from me and our sister could count on me to be a nice big brother. I would make up encounters with people I knew, oh, me! Just getting home on my bike after a hearty dinner with my devoted family. I had these incredibly detailed ideas about who I could be and what my various families would be like in various regions of the city. The most lovely way for me to leave my house during those times was to go bicycling. That oasis was taken from me when my bike was taken. I was restricted to walking only about my house. That wasn't very far. In any case, I looked all over the streets for my bike. But, I never did. So it was home. I awaited the arrival of Christmas. One night, I was awakened by a violent storm outside. However, it wasn't a loud thunder. I was prompted to go by the sound of my bike bell. I could hear that ancient bike bell from a mile away despite the rain and thunder. I jumped out of bed as I awaited the next chime. Then it arrived. Now a little louder, ding! There it was. Definitely my bell, there! At the end of the snap, it hitched in the same manner. I rose and walked over to the window. My room had a view of the backyard of the house next door. It was drenching outside, and the storm appeared to be passing directly overhead. However, there it was. My bicycle, they have a backyard. Keeping it level while standing up straight with the kickstand deployed. It stood motionless in the center of their backyard. A rider awaiting a ride. I had to get it back. Now! I dressed in a sweatshirt, slacks, and windbreaker before sneaking downstairs. I slipped on some boots and snuck out the back door because it appeared to be a tsunami outside. I kept close to our house as I made my way to the fence because the frequent lightning made it difficult to move stealthily. In order to look for my bike, I crouched down and peered through the fence towards the backyard lawn. But it had vanished. I got to my feet and leaned over the fence to get a clear view of the backyard. But it was vacant. What did I observe? I replayed the scene of my bike standing erect in the pouring rain. Yes! There it was! Observed that! You couldn't persuade me otherwise! I noticed several reflections in the grass with my eyes. Through the downpour, I kept my attention on them. They were what? My cycling cards! Not many of them. But I owned them. I used the same brand with them. My gaze followed the path as it rose to the house's back steps. Then I noticed it. My bicycle was partially hidden by shadows as it lay on the porch. Bike cards were falling down the stairs as its front wheel slowly spun. As the storm stormed, the back door opened and shut erratically. The elderly woman was back and waiting at the door. She extended her hand to me while grinning and offered the bike. This time, I didn't wait for her face to disappear. I sprinted back inside, shut the doors, and then climbed into bed with my wet jacket and boots. But that happened a very long time ago. 5 years or more. I turned around the fence and prepared to enter the premises for the first time. I was standing on the line between our properties as Lindsay watched me with interest. She questioned my well-being. All I required to move into unfamiliar area was that. Despite my worries, nothing happened as I crossed. Or perhaps nothing negative occurred. Lindsay ran past me and touched my arm as she did so. The aroma that emanated from her captured my attention. For the next 40 minutes, I followed her about like a lapdog and assisted her and her dad with the final box unloading. Dan and Alana, her parents, were beautiful. Even more beautiful down here than from looking up from my unsettling window. I declined their invitation to join them for some lemonade. My dad will soon be home, so I should be returning, I remarked. Dan and Alana left the room. If my dad and I were interested, they would bring pizza back for dinner after returning the moving truck to the depot. Pizza has always piqued my interest. Their daughter, too. And I bet I could convince my dad as well. He would soon be returning from work, and I would feel a little safer if he accompanied me. Lindsay and I said goodbye on the back porch after Dan and Alana left. I was prompted to enter for some lemonade by her question. And I really wanted to. But I was unable. Something stopped me. My cheek received a direct kiss from her as she leaned in. My legs gave way as I felt like explosives had gone off in my chest. Lindsay pretended like she hadn't just turned my body into oatmeal while getting another package. She momentarily paused before continuing on her way to sing over her shoulder that she needed to bring some boxes downstairs and wishes she could have had some help. I wished I could be of assistance. But I did nothing but remain motionless. My chest was pounding with the beat of my heart. Why couldn't I wonder? What prevented me from offering my assistance? Nothing. Don't act like a baby. I could hear Lindsay returning up the stairs. As she pulled another box from the stack, she noticed that I was still standing there. She chuckled while shaking her head. Okay, screw it. I ascended and landed on the bottom step. I hung on. I swiftly moved on to the following several stages after thinking, "You're okay." Now that I was on the porch, I had a clear view of the kitchen and the entrance to the lower level. I entered for the first time. Observed its brightness, etc. I had no idea how far light actually traveled in this space. I was pleasantly surprised by how welcoming everything was. The kitchen was crammed with boxes, each labeled for a certain location and containing just about anything. Lindsay got back up and pretended to be shocked to see me as she stood in the doorway. She approached, grinned, and gave me a bear embrace. I sank like a lawn chair when she kissed my other cheek this time, however, I managed to keep my feet under me. Lindsay reached for a box and threw it my way. She then took one for herself and winked at me. My feet may have already moved, but I certainly recall following her to the doorway. Then I was heading down the stairs. I afterwards went downstairs. No! Not in the basement! There was no downstairs here. This was a cellar. Or a basement. It was completely decayed. In the center of the empty basement, Lindsay was standing and staring back at me. She no longer had the package she was carrying in her hands. And I discovered I lacked one in mine. Then it all hit me. I only ever saw a real estate representative at the house, which was my third interaction with it. My new replacement bike, which at this point wasn't all that new, was what I recalled riding by. The woman was outside on the porch of the house, looking around. I couldn't tell if she was simply entering or exiting. She smiled broadly as she waved me over, though. I was welcomed when I rode up to the property's edge. She said that she couldn't do a walkthrough because the front door's key was missing from the lockbox and asked me if I had seen anyone about the property. I said that I hadn't seen anyone and that no one truly dropped by the house. She groaned, irritated. She asserted that she had to enter immediately. She then had a thought. She requested if I would climb via the basement window, enter the house, and open the door. The scariest question anyone had ever posed to me was that. I vehemently opposed doing that. As I usually do, I answered with a string of ums and ahs and a final no thanks. Even I couldn't understand my response. She didn't present me with anything. All I knew was that neither she nor anyone else was the reason I entered. I re-engaged the gears on my bike. She shouted at me, asking if I could assist my mother. Whatever the reason, that cut me like a knife. She spoke with such a sharp edge. Like she was aware that I didn't. Yes, I answered. And moved forward up my driveway. Liar! She muttered it to me. It seemed to be directly over my shoulder. Adjacent to my ear. She had moved to the home when I turned around, though. Since I no longer kept my bike outside, I rolled it into our home and hurried up to my room. The real estate agent had left by the time I arrived. I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by one of the upstairs windows out of the corner of my eye. But by the time my eyes landed on it, it was gone. I fixed Lindsay with my gaze in the basement, and she returned the gaze. And everything was clear. Every recollection I have of the house involves it luring me inside. Bike that was taken. The helpful real estate agent asks for assistance. I was captivated by the lovely, loving family and the daughter who set off my puberty. The home eventually recognized me. Played the long game and did nothing except sit, wait, and watch. It took in all I was surrounded by. It was more familiar with me than I am. With the exception of the light coming from the steps, the windows vanished, leaving the basement completely dark. In front of it, two shadows moved by. Dan and Chris. They grinned as they glanced down at me. But it wasn't them. Actually, they weren't her parents. They really weren't anything. I guess they were ghosts. Perhaps projections from the house. I pictured my father returning from work to an empty house. And never again seeing me. My antique bike bell could be heard chiming in the pitch blackness. "Welcome back," Lindsay remarked. But Lindsay was no longer there. It was a squeaky-voiced elderly woman. She glided toward me as the light faded from her face. "I currently reside here."
I wasn't sure what to think when I first met Sandra Kelly. I didn't know her before she booked a counseling session, it seemed like she did it out of the blue. She had just contacted the office, scheduled a meeting with my assistant, and then showed up. It was the last session of the day on a gray November Thursday. My workspace was covered in a long shadow caused by an awkwardly positioned streetlight outside. Sandra moved in her seat as I shut the blinds. She said, "I've sought treatment previously. But I feel like nobody truly pays attention, always." I said, "Therapy is frequently misconstrued. It doesn't imply that there is a problem with you. Just maintenance, really. As washing your hands or having a shower." She chuckled, "I haven't done my dishes in weeks." As she continuously slapped herself overhead the head, a shadow descended over her face. With every whack, her brown, wavy hair swayed. "No," she exclaimed. "My dishes are done. It's okay. I was making things up. I don't lie." I remarked as I sat down across from her, "No worries. Let's just talk and get to know each other, I say." She calmed down and nodded, "That sounds nice. I'm grateful." The sole child of Tomskog, Minnesota residents Bev and Linda Kelly, Sandra was born in 1993. When talking about her upbringing, Sandra exhibited a sense of distance as if she were reciting a prepared statement. They were distant and quite strict. They occasionally didn't appear like parents at all, the woman claimed. There was no warmth, notwithstanding their times. She continued by relaying tales of how they would beat her if they believed she was lying. She once went 3 days without eating since they didn't ask her about her day at school. They claimed that withholding information amounted to lying. They occasionally made good decisions. Her room was usually well stocked with flowers and toys, and they frequently took her swimming at Frog Lake. She acknowledged that it was odd. Swimming was practically a chore. Every week, twice, rain or shine. When it was too chilly to swim, they would give her a mud bath and scrub her properly. It became customary. Right down to using it to rub my gums. It seems as though Sandra ignored it. She didn't think much of her upbringing or parents. She became more worried and frequently paused as she talked about her background to make sure she was remembering it correctly. She seemed to place a lot of importance on accuracy, perhaps as a holdover from her rigid upbringing. She added, "But I'm not here to talk about what once was. I'm here to discuss the here and now." I nodded and said, "Okay. Let's discuss it. Who are you right now?" She groaned, "I'm a liar. I've begun to tell lies." I waited for her to elaborate, but she only said that. Her huge revelation was that. I sat back in my chair and held on to my notebook. I questioned, "Does it happen often?" She shrugged, "Not really. Once in a while. But I find it incredibly annoying. People constantly tell small lies, Sandra. They are still decent people despite it. They don't inform them the way I do." We met eyes, And I immediately recognized her sincerity. She was genuinely concerned by this. This felt to her like confessing to a murder. She said, "My falsehoods are different from others. I'm not sure how to describe it. They transform things." "Most lies work," I remarked. "They alter how we see things. They influence." "Yes," she said, "but all they do is deceive people. Lies don't alter the truth of what occurs." "Sandra, what do you mean?" She shifted in her chair uncomfortably. She inhaled deeply and sought solace by touching a curling strand of her brown hair. She said in a quiet voice while looking directly into my eyes, "Just as you closed the blinds, the streetlight outside broke." I turned to face the window again. It's odd that I hadn't realized it. My patient would have been directly exposed to that uncomfortable light, but it was now pitch black. "Very perceptive," I remarked. "I barely noticed." She explained, "That's because I lied. Even if it seems true, it's not. The moment I mentioned the light didn't function, it did so perfectly." "You turned it off, then?" I queried. "How about your lies?" "Yes." She was completely serious. I stood up and looked out the window. She was right, the light was totally out. It seemed odd that I hadn't noticed it sooner, but occasionally you can become so engrossed in routine that you miss the obvious. She appeared defeated as I reclined. She groaned, "That's the thing. Persuading people that I am telling the truth is incredibly difficult. That my lies cause things to alter." "Exactly how would that work?" I queried. "I'm not sure," Sandra said. "But when I arrived here today, I didn't have an appointment. I lied about having one, and then I did." I grinned, "That's not right. We received a call on Tuesday. We have your contact information in hand." I held up my phone to display the confirmation to her. "I can see it now." Sandra persisted, "I alter things. What I say alters circumstances. It modifies the past in order to account for my lies." "Sandra, when did this all begin?" She remarked, "I believe it has always been like way. I believe my parents were aware. They may have taught me not to lie because of this." "But you kept on lying," I remarked. "Can you recall a recent event?" Sandra added, "There have been a few accidents. I once had a friend who attended veterinary school and a friend who knew someone who worked at a bank. We hadn't spoken in a while, and when we finally reconnected, I confused them. I was absolutely certain that the guy I spoke to had attended veterinary school. However, they didn't? No. I'm sure they had a job at a bank. They both attended veterinary school now, though. They were unable to." I declared, "Memory is a delicate thing. Which is more likely, that you remembered incorrectly or that your misunderstanding altered what previously occurred?" "I am aware of your desired response, yet the evidence is overwhelming." "So, Sandra, what brought you here today?" "I'd like to quit lying. I want to stop lying forever." A sigh of relief escaped her lips. While taking notes on my notepad, I nodded. "What's holding you back?" I queried. "What prevents you from being really truthful?" "Honestly? It is addictive," she declared. "It's difficult to stop once you get going." "How so?" "I don't believe you comprehend. The opportunities are endless. What would stop you from simply snapping your fingers all day if you could win the lotto by doing so?" "I guess I'm sticking out like a sore thumb." "That's how it seems to me," she remarked. "It sticks out in my mind like a sore thumb. Every falsehood I say merely detracts from something." I remarked, "Life is full of tiny annoyances." "I don't believe you should penalize yourself for coping mechanisms," she said. "It's not just coping, and it's not just putting myself through hell. It simply occurs, much like overusing a muscle. It hurts. It aches." "Is that the reason you struck your head against the side when we first started talking?" She nodded, "Yeah. It deters attention from internal suffering." "Well, Sandra, part of what you're saying is simply not conceivable. The past cannot be changed. Given the way you were taught, I can understand why you would want to, but it is simply impossible. Sandra held up her hand and said, I'm going to stop you right there. Describe an activity you carried out this morning. Okay, I donned some brand new white socks. So why are you wearing no socks? I felt foolish as soon as I uttered it. I didn't have a spare pair of shoes because I had walked in a water puddle on the way to work. My soaked socks were still dangling from the radiator in the restroom. I grinned. You didn't let me finish. I do have them, but not just now, said the speaker. No, see? It evolves. You simply have to adjust to it as it evolves. She slammed her head against the wall and clenched her eyes shut. Sweat beads trickled down her forehead. Sandra, consider it from my perspective. Which is more likely, that you observed my lack of socks and made use of the information, or that you have the power to alter the fundamental fabric of events? I recognize the sound. But that is what takes place. The only sensation I have is a crackle in the back of my head as long as it is only minor stuff. However, it feels like I'm being torn apart as soon as I start saying major lies. Do you mean anything we can't overlook with massive lies? Do you have any illustrations? She nodded. The first lie I ever told. When I was a child, I had this dream about sunflowers. They were all over the place, swaying in the breeze. I drew these on a piece of paper when I arrived at school. Since the yellow crayon was gone, I colored them blue instead. That sounds wonderful. Up until I arrived home, it was. There was a vast field of blue sunflowers in our backyard. Of course, my parents pretended as though it had always been there. But it wasn't, she said. Mom had a garden there, so no. Her crop was tomato. She insisted they were store-bought despite the fact that we still had some in the fridge. So they never discovered you were lying, right? At first, no, but I felt so awful I confessed. I went 3 days without eating after that. They said I hadn't informed them of the drawing fast enough. Well, Sandra, I doubt you will be able to persuade me that this is true. But it doesn't matter. What matters most is that it is true for you. There are ways to stop lying if you want to. But I want to identify the source of the issue and find out how it started. I'm disappointed that you don't take my word for it. Sandra, I'm sorry to say this, but what you're saying is just not conceivable. It really worries me. We exchanged glances. Sandra and I both remained stationary. When your pen ran out of ink, why have you been pretending to write all this time? I grinned. It's only to relax the patient. Like a physician using a stethoscope. Although expected, it is not always feasible. Listen to Sandra is all that has been written over the past 40 pages. Of course it is, I said, grinning. I practice my cursive like that. And you don't think this is weird in any way? Not a thing? While coincidences do occur, everything you've mentioned is something I can definitely recall. A reality that has been presented cannot surprise me. However, that's simply yuck. A single drop of blood dribbled from Sandra's nose, and she wiped it. She declined the handkerchief I handed her. She was obviously affected by this. She stated, I've spoken to 8 other people about this. No matter what, people continue to reject me. Regardless of the ridiculous evidence I offer, all they do is rationalize it and label me insane. Sandra, I don't believe you are. I believe you've experienced trauma. It's not a trauma, damn it. Sandra got to her feet and started pacing. She was becoming upset. I delicately placed my hand on her shoulder as I got to my feet next to her. Can I get anything for you? Tea or coffee? She questioned. You're married, right? Do you cherish your wife? Sure, that. With my entire heart. Do you, however? Are you really, truly in love with her? Undoubtedly. Sandra's head shook. Can you already feel the joy she brings into your life? Indeed, but what? Why, therefore, Are you thinking about divorcing her? My chest felt as though a knife had been twisted. Although it seemed so strange at the moment, I had undoubtedly been thinking about it for some time. I couldn't immediately come up with a rationale, and the way that made me feel was simply horrible. Over the years, Millie and I had our ups and downs, but we always grew stronger as a result. Yes, we had a difficult time the previous several weeks, but Sandra remarked, you said you loved her. You claimed to be a contented spouse. Later, something altered. Not much has changed, though. I looked at my head. I had an odd feeling that something had turned my entire world upside down. Sandra's eyes forced two tiny red tears out of the blood they contained. You must trust me, Sandra said. Please trust me. I'm attempting, but... Sandra hissed, fine, let's go. Fuck it, let's go. She shoved me into my chair while putting on her jacket. I thought about requesting security when she started acting threatening. She then sat down across from me as soon as I took a seat. She grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go. Do you recall stabbing your wife last night? She questioned. Exactly how did she know? My mind began to rush, and I opened my mouth wide like a fucking trout. There had been no other visitors. It had been a mistake or an accident. Although we had discussed it, there had been no serious discussion about getting a divorce. Then it just got worse. You laid her to rest in the backyard. Your hands still have a soiled odor. She continued, what do you think about that? No, you cannot. My body was starting to shut down. Something like a shock factor is going through my head. My eyes began to tear up, and my hands began to tremble. I could clearly recall every detail. Shovel after shovel of soil smothered Millie's gentle hands. I tried to scrub the fragrance from my hands but was unsuccessful. My fingernails still had dirt under them. I had tried to ignore it after it had already happened. Pretending there is nothing. An excuse? Why would you act in that way? You did love her, right? I did. I had a deep, abiding love for Millie, yet you continued to keep her head wrapped in plastic in the back of your goddamn freezer. No doubt. I was unable to let her go. I started crying. I sobbed like a real baby. Sandra was unable to have known this. I hadn't even fully acknowledged it to myself. Compartmentalizing. 1,000 minor factors contributed to what I did, but seeing them all laid bare in front of me like this was too much. My entire universe was imploding. Even though my mental stability had already been perched precariously close to sliding off the cliff, it now felt as though I was falling naturally. A pallid hand outdoors feeding the worms. A bleach and chlorine-smelling bathroom. I couldn't bear to look at that perfectly nice hacksaw ever again. Through flimsy plastic, I could see green eyes imploring me, why? I was so furious that I threw myself off the chair. She is unable to know. Suddenly, Sandra was bleeding from her mouth, eyes, and nose. Even so, she grinned. She exclaimed, every time. Why doesn't anyone ever pay attention? You've had enough, I say. Really? Sandra shoved me aside, breaking the table leg in our line of sight. She used a hat rack to hold me down as I fell to the ground on my back. You put your daughter to death in a well. With your vehicle, you struck your mother. You used the loaded gun in your car's trunk to kill 3 hitchhikers. I couldn't help but scream as the memories rushed back to me. It was actual. All of it. Exactly how did she know? It had been a while. I was so good at hiding my tracks. She was dragged down to the floor next to me after I grabbed hold of her foot. I could hardly see her through my tears, but I knew I had to take action. I had to end the discomfort. I had to cut her off. She resisted my attempts to put my hands around her neck. I underestimated her might. She choked when one of my hands touched her neck and said, then again. Hasn't everything I've said today been a lie? My thoughts vanished totally. My vision began to blur as I noticed Sandra standing up. Her eyes were fully blood red and swollen. Coughing continuously, She continued to pound the side of her head with the palm of her hand. She most likely has a bruise from me. But it was. The biggest things take some time to make sense of, she remarked. Give it time, I said. I don't, that wasn't anything I did. No, I didn't. Naturally, no. I only said false things. But why? How? Sandra sighed, I guess that's enough. I won't claim to be surprised. Nobody ever gives me credit. Just try to keep Sandra Kelly, a young human woman, in your mind rather than the image you have of me. I was still seated on the floor as she left the office. I was even unable to comprehend why. I had no cause to be angry or confront her. Sure, she had been inciting me with ideas of my family being harmed, but to assault her in that manner? It was crazy. Or some sort of hysteria brought on by stress. The dim light from the streetlight outside warmed the back of my neck as I sat by myself in my office. I'm not sure what to believe, and I'm not sure if I'll ever reason anything to the point of insanity, but I do know that it completely shocked me. Sandra had a quality that I had never noticed in another patient. And to some extent, I think she is aware of an impossibility. In addition, even though Millie was sound asleep in the adjacent room, I was actually afraid when I returned home that evening and opened my freezer. However, the astonishment I felt upon hearing what Sandra had spoken and the mental pictures it sparked persisted. It was still there, the empty space in my garden, the hacksaw in the garage. Unused. That night, when I dreamed of murder, I tightly clutched Millie. As though it had actually occurred. If only momentarily.